Chapter 428. As for you, he pointed at Su Sheng. I advise you to control your emotions. The first time, I drew out another you in your subconscious and temporarily suppressed that miserable you. Then, the you I drew out was pulled back again. Now, I've drawn out another you. But I'm not the first you I have drawn out. The reason why I'm not willing to do this is that I'm actually inducing you to have a split personality. Split personality? Do you understand? Su Sheng frowned. What? Li Yunxin sighed. In short, there are two other you hiding in your head right now. If this you is suppressed again, and you still want me to help you pass the tribulation, I'll draw out a fourth you. This is playing with fire. You're a sage with strong spiritual power, but I don't know where your limit is. Maybe 5 or 6, maybe 50 or 60. But he looked helpless and didn't know what to say. He could only spread his hands. You control your emotions, okay, my friend? Su Sheng didn't know what split personality was, but judging from Li Yunxin's rare serious tone, he knew that he wasn't lying. So he took a few deep breaths and said, Sigh. I'll do as you say. But next, just wait. Li Yunxin raised her eyes and looked into the distance. From the time he fought with the golden photon until now, only a very short time had passed, not even half an hour. But the camp of the coalition army of the secular dynasties was already in chaos. The immortals didn't like these mortals very much. Although the two sides weren't far apart, they didn't bother to tell them many things. Perhaps it was because they considered that the opponent this time was a demon. In the face of such a magical enemy, many of the methods of the secular people were useless, including the methods of secrecy. So most people didn't know what was going on tonight. When the ignorant mortals saw such a scene and momentum, they only thought that the demons were invading. For a moment, more than 100,000 people panicked, and the camp was about to be overturned by the army. However, he didn't know that this was just a true state fiendish demon and a true state cultivator. If it was really a large-scale invasion, 99% of them wouldn't even be able to see the appearance of the demon, and they would probably die. The flames on the campsite gradually merged into one. Li Yunxin continued. Perhaps the Freemasons are coming. Jing Guangzi said that their two sages know what I'm thinking and are willing to accept me, so they won't let me die here in vain. Su Sheng wanted to say something but hesitated. But in the end he couldn't help but say, what if he doesn't come? At this point, his tone did not sound like reproach or complaint, but pure curiosity. He was very curious. What kind of attitude would this sinister and cunning demon have when he fell into such a situation because of a moment of impulse? He reincarnated to cultivate the 7 emotions and 6 sensory pleasures, and met many interesting people. However, it was rare to see someone like Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin thought about it. With a faint smile he said, Then you can only die. Su Sheng furrowed his brows in confusion. Die? The kind of death you're thinking of, Li Yunxin said lightly. Everyone has to die. Su Sheng paused for a moment. Die tonight? Here. Looking at his expression and tone, Li Yunxin suddenly burst out laughing. Take a look, take a look. Even someone like you can't jump out of this limitation. What's so surprising about me dying here tonight? Is there anyone who doesn't die? I know what you're thinking. Everyone thinks they're the main character. Everyone thinks they'll have good luck. Almost everyone, before doing something, can't help but think of a good result, and not a bad one. For example, those Qing soldiers escorting the Red Earth into the rolling mountains thought, what will happen after this trip? They always felt that their chances of survival were high. That Jing Guangzi brought a body full of magical treasures. He knew I would be difficult to deal with. But he also thought about what would happen after I killed that Li Yunxin. He didn't think about what would happen if he died. Including this Ku Chanzi. He raised his hand and pointed at the sky. Right now, he's also thinking about what will happen after he kills me. Everyone, from their own point of view, feels that a lot of luck is on their side. But the problem is, if fate is a river, and people's subjective emotions and external factors are the water in the surging river, if you jump out of the river and look down on it, you will find that everyone has a lot of chances of dying. Dying 10 years ago is not strange. Dying a year ago is not strange. Dying tonight is also not strange. If everyone thinks, I can't die here. Then they really won't die. How could there be so many dead people in the world? That's why I said to Jean Guangzi earlier that when it comes to strategy, wandering souls like her have a natural flaw. She thinks too much of herself. If she can't even let go of her own life and death and thinks, what will happen if I die at every step? How can she do anything good? This is the so-called bystanders see the most clearly. So if I die tonight, what's so hard to accept? If he said these words to people in the secular world, they would probably think that it was long and boring, full of irrelevant principles. However, when Su Sheng heard it, he was stunned for a moment. After being stunned for a while, he suddenly turned his head to look at Li Yunxin, as if he recognized him for the first time. There's actually someone like you? Naturally, he knew that people weren't the main characters that they thought they were. But even the most objective person's thoughts and ideas were limited to their own physical bodies. Because of this, they would always be affected by this physical body. They couldn't be objective to themselves like they were to others. You stand in a certain place, facing a row of strange-looking people. Although they have different shapes, you know that there is a most fundamental difference between you and them. This difference is far greater than any difference between them. They are not you. But now, listening to Li Yunxin's words and thinking about the things he did in the past, Su Sheng vaguely understood what kind of attitude he had toward himself and the world. Li Yunxin seemed to never take himself too seriously. Or in other words, in his eyes, the body that he lived in was almost no different from other people. The only difference was that his body was easier to control and was more convenient to control. Because of this, just like what he said to Jean Guangzi before, and just said to himself, when he did things, he was cruel to himself. He rarely thought about whether it was safe for him to do this. What he prioritized was whether it was more likely to succeed by doing this. There was an essential difference between the two. Because of this, he seemed to be able to accept his death calmly tonight, as if it was not him who died, but one of those cultivators or even many mortals. Su Sheng used to be a sage. He reincarnated to cultivate the 7 emotions and 6 desires. And he didn't have much recognition and sense of belonging to the body he transformed into. Therefore, in Dongting, Su Weng could talk about his death bluntly without any reluctance. But even with the personal ability of a sage, he felt that he couldn't be as cold and objective as Li Yunxin. This Li Yunxin, who on earth was he before? Heaven and earth are heartless. They treat all living things like straw dogs. Su Sheng thought for a while in shock and finally murmured these 2 sentences. In the past, I once discussed with the art saint about the supreme oblivion. She said these 2 sentences. I didn't understand it at that time. I didn't understand it before today. Now after listening to your words, Li Yunxin, I finally understand the meaning of your words. Do you compare yourself to the world? The real supreme indifference. Is it another meaning? Li Yunxin was a little surprised. Who would have thought that a few words of his out of the blue would cause this saint to sigh with emotion? Maybe this guy recultivated the emotions and desires, so he was more sensitive than ordinary people. But he didn't want to let Su Sheng continue to think. It had been like this since ancient times. As long as people began to think about philosophical issues, such as their own existence and value, they were always easy to get into a dead end and make themselves unhappy. He worked hard to pull out the 3rd Su Sheng from his subconscious and asked about the spell of the immortal bone. He didn't want to make Su Sheng feel sleepy again, so he had to make the 4th Su Sheng. This kind of thing, the more he did, the more difficult it would be. Therefore, he clapped his hands and interrupted Su Sheng's thoughts. It's boring to wait. I have something to ask you. Su Sheng was still absent-minded after saying this. Li Yunxin snapped his fingers in his ear. Su Sheng was now a little person the size of a thumb. The sound of Li Yunxin's fingers was more than a thunder to him. He fell down and slid into the folds of the big sleeve. He shouted angrily. I got to the key point. You have a lot of time to study. I will send you away before I die. But I want to ask you another question. It's more important. He took a light breath, thought for a while, and said casually, you used to be a saint, so you know more about the Tao than me. Then, for example, If I cultivate the divine power of the soul transforming into the real body, if I transform into a real body, and my main body dies, will my real body also die? Or will it live alone? Su Sheng was stunned. Just for this? Didn't your previous teachers teach you? Li Yunxin pouted. I don't have any teachers at the moment. I've taught myself for a long time. Su Sheng opened his mouth. He seemed to want to exclaim or feel emotional. But in the end he shook his head. Fine. Okay, the matter of the soul transforming into the real body. Let me put it this way. This way of calling it is actually wrong. There is only one part of the soul, and it can't be split up. For example, after a person dies, his soul is damaged, and he becomes a ghost with dementia. This can be seen. So the soul transforming into the real body is actually not really splitting the soul. It's just a projection. You should have cultivated the Xianting true solution. Li Yunxin shook his head. No. Su Sheng stared blankly for a moment before saying, all right. Then you must have cultivated the golden core connection contract. Li Yunxin shook his head. No. Su Sheng frowned. You didn't cultivate either of these? Then what about the Desheng book, Zhuang Miaofa, and Ziwei Venerable Scriptures? Li Yunxin spread his hands. I have heard of them. Su Sheng was stunned for a full 3 breaths. Then he said, You didn't cultivate any of these things, but you went to learn the Tao. You didn't go mad and die early, that's really. That's why I'm so pitiful. Li Yunxin smiled. I'm just lucky, along with a bit of intelligence. Su Sheng raised his head and looked at him, shaking his head several times. Who knew if he was exclaiming that this person was a genius, or that his luck was off the charts, or that he wasted his talent? After a while he sighed. Okay. I'll say it plainly. A portion of the soul is merged into your body. The other portion is hidden in the various meridians and acupoints. It was impossible for a part of this thing to be dissolved. The so-called true body is actually an illusion of a new body, meridians and acupoints. The source and foundation of this thing is still the main body. As long as the main body isn't destroyed, this incarnation is no different from the main body. This is also why when the incarnation is destroyed, the main body will suffer heavy injuries. This heavy injury isn't because you lost a portion of your soul. If you really lost a portion of your soul, you would have long become stupid. Instead, it is equivalent to the enemy's spiritual energy passing through your body, meridians and acupoints, projecting onto your main body. From this, you should know that the main body is the trunk, the foundation. The incarnation is like the branches and leaves. If the main body is destroyed, it is like the trunk and foundation being cut off. The incarnation won't work. When Li Yunxin heard him say all this, his expression was really calm, like there wasn't much novelty in it. It was like he already knew these things, and was only seeking confirmation from the most authoritative person in the world. When he said this, he continued, But if the trunk falls, the branches and leaves can still live for some time. Su Sheng smiled. You want to say that if the main body is destroyed, the split incarnation can still live for some time. That is indeed the case. However, this situation is also very rare. Under the true realm, one can't practice this divine ability, so it doesn't matter whether the incarnation is or not. Above the true realm, the body is already extremely strong. Ordinary small injuries aren't enough to kill. To kill through cutting the body, either exploding the entire body, or like you killed this golden light, crushing the head. But the head is the master of the 100 acupoints. Once the heavy injury leads to death, the acupoints will be greatly damaged, and the soul will also be heavily injured. Even if the body is still intact, the soul won't be able to stay for long. The split incarnation naturally only has the time to snap a finger. Li Yunxin faintly said, Oh! Su Sheng didn't say anything. He stared at him for a while, then suddenly said, But tonight, you aren't afraid of death, because there is indeed a way to survive. Isn't that right? Without hesitation, Li Yunxin giggled, Yes. He stretched his body and said, It's so boring to sit through the long night. Do you want this? As he said this, he flipped his palm and took out a wine pot. It was a silver pot, exactly the same as the one he crushed and threw to the wine shop owner outside the camp. It was small and exquisite, and there were 3 young characters on the base, Mu Nanshan. It was obvious that the wine in the pot was Mu Nanshuan's unique wine. Chapter 429. Su Sheng's mind was clear at the moment. He didn't seem to want to drink, so he shook his head. Li Yunxin didn't try to persuade him either. He used one finger to stir the wine in the pot, turning it into a silver thread, and poured it into his mouth. He drank about half of it in one breath before putting it down. His expression was a bit gloomy. Alas, this wine is old Lu's favorite. Su Sheng listened to his words, frowned slightly, and looked at him for a while. He felt that the sudden loneliness on his face was real. He said, "I know about your old Lu, but I also heard, after you were attacked on Mount June. After he was captured, he confessed about your two protectors. Those two protectors have the fate of imparting techniques to you, so they can be considered your disciples. Don't you hate them?" Li Yunxin put down the wine pot, one arm behind him, the other on his knees. He looked up at the sky for a while and sighed. When I first met him, he was very timid. But later, I slowly realized that his courage is hidden in his bones. Since that's the case, he doesn't have the courage. If he has the courage, he will be bigger and more ruthless than anyone else. After saying these words, he was silent for a while. Then he looked down at Su Sheng and said seriously, "If it were me, I would do the same." Su Sheng frowned. "Confess about your two disciples, to save your own life?" Li Yunxin smiled and shook his head. He confessed them, not for his own life but for mine. Su Sheng, who had recultivated the 7 emotions and 6 sensory pleasures, had an unusual curiosity about all kinds of strange emotions in the world. Now that he heard Li Yunxin's words, his interest was piqued. "What do you mean?" Li Yunxin hesitated for a while and looked at him. Su Sheng was slightly surprised. Then he understood and sneered. "Just now, when your life was hanging by a thread in the fire cloud, when you asked me about the immortal's curse, you didn't guard against me. But now you're wary?" Li Yunxin smiled. "Fine. I mean the situation that day. When he and I were ambushed, we were completely defenseless. I'm a weak person, and I've lived in fear until now. It's only because many people didn't care about me in the beginning, and I could always get more information. That's why the situation at that time was extremely dangerous. If I wasn't careful, I would have really died. I understand this, and so does Lu Gongzan. So in the end, I couldn't protect him, and he borrowed my dragon palace to escape. I couldn't take him away either. If I take him with me, he will be a burden. There is a burden. Either he will be killed by the cultivator who is chasing me, or he will be killed by the cultivator who is chasing me. With his realm, if he gets involved in that kind of thing, there's no way he can survive. So there's only one choice: he stays there. Perhaps there's a 10% chance of survival. Those cultivators, they've all become demons. You can say that he's cold or stubborn. He might have a way out if he doesn't play by the rules. So he didn't hesitate to give up those two. The people from Xianmen went to take a look, and what he said was true. So they killed them. They knew this was his proof of allegiance. You see, he has no backbone, and he's afraid of death. He immediately changes sides when things go wrong. Isn't that how people who work with demons should behave? In fact, by doing this, sacrificing those two demons, his chance of survival is very slim. If it's for himself, he won't do such a thing. However, if it's for me— Li Yunxin paused, took a deep breath and exhaled a white mist. If it's for me, this old guy can probably slaughter everyone in the world. Not to mention those two demons. He knows that I'm in such a dangerous situation. Any hope, any help, is extremely precious to me, and I have to try at all costs. He also knows that I like to play chess. So he treats himself as a chess piece. If he wants to live, even if he doesn't know how far he can live, whether he can see me again, and whether he can help me again, he has to survive first. In fact, I did a lot of things like this, regardless of whether it's useful or not. As long as I feel that it's possible, I'll casually make a move. Perhaps it'll come in handy at some point. So I used the lives of those two demons and my own life to gamble. Hearing this, Su Sheng frowned. Did you think of all this yourself? How can you be sure that he really thinks so? Li Yunxin raised the wine pot, and drank the remaining half-pot of wine in one gulp. He let out a long breath and looked at Su Sheng from the corner of his eyes. Otherwise, how do you think I know that golden light brought a Dao tool to Mount Chuyan? Su Sheng was surprised. Could it be? Li Yunxin put his finger on his lips and shushed him. Are you afraid that the people outside can't hear you? Su Sheng shut his mouth. But in the end, he couldn't hold it back, and said, however, golden light severely injured your black cat demon, and you wanted to kill her to vent your anger. This Lu Gongzan gave up 2 of your generals. What do you want? Li Yunxin slowly squeezed the empty silver pot in his hand into a small ball, and was silent for a while. I don't know. Sigh. This kind of thing. Su Sheng sighed. I really want to see with my own eyes what you'll say to him after you see him, and how you'll deal with him. This kind of thing is really a rare and strange sight. My heart is itching to hear this. Li Yunxin was stunned, and then he smashed the silver pot in his hand. You're AF** king pervert, aren't you? He smashed it to the side, and Su Sheng was able to avoid it in time. He didn't find it strange. Instead, there seemed to be some kind of subtle atmosphere slowly spreading between the two of them. One was a former saint, who had dispersed his cultivation to recultivate. The other was a peerless demon, who had always been lonely. But tonight, these two people, who were supposed to be irreconcilable enemies, were chatting and laughing under the moonlight. Who knew how long such a time would last? And so, almost an hour had passed. The Allied army's campsite that was originally far away was ablaze, as if it was on fire. But now the fire was getting smaller. The human voices were also gradually quieting, and the situation seemed to be under control. Ku Chanzi and the true state cultivators had profound cultivation base. But slowly, some of the cultivators in the place of the outer fringe started to feel resentful. That demon had tortured and killed a Kinzo cultivator in front of them. But now, he was sitting leisurely in the prohibition spell, and he would even laugh occasionally. How arrogant and unreasonable was he? But they could only watch from here. The more they watched, the angrier they were. Therefore, some people stood up and sat quietly impatiently. Some people did this, and some people followed suit. In the end, the cultivators in the place of the outer fringe gathered in groups of 2s and 3s, and discussed in low voices. They thought that such a passive wait had really lowered the Shuaman's morale. Moreover, the great war with the demon was imminent. If the demon attacked tomorrow, wouldn't this long sun be able to escape? He was obviously right in front of them, but he had escaped in vain. This kind of thing. Who could endure it? But just as the crowd was getting excited, a sharp-eyed person suddenly pointed to the northwest horizon and said, "Someone's coming." For a moment, dozens of divine senses were cast in that direction. The black tower that the cultivators built at the front line was originally at the northeast of this place. Obviously, the person who came was not a visitor from the black tower. The northwest was the direction of Cloud Mountain. But even so, these cultivators in the place of the outer fringe frowned slightly. There seemed to be a trace of doubt in their expressions. This was because the cultivators of Daotong and Kenzo, although their main cultivation methods were different, their spiritual power and aura were extremely similar. In the words of the Xianmen, it was possessing a noble and righteous aura in one's chest. But the person who came did not purposely conceal her aura. Instead, she purposely released it, as if she was afraid that someone would harm her without distinguishing between friend and foe. But the problem was, even so, his aura was still very puzzling. There was some noble aura of the Xianmen, but there was also some demonic aura. These cultivators in the place of the outer fringe were puzzled, so they looked at the 4 connoisseurs who were still sitting quietly. Ku Chanzi and the 3 true state cultivators did not have any strange expressions, so they were slightly relieved. After waiting for the time it takes for half an incense stick to burn, they could see the appearance of the person who came from the faraway horizon. Then they were slightly surprised. The person who came was a female cultivator, but she did not wear a Taoist robe. Instead, she wore a red and green robe. Ordinary people would always look tacky if they wore red and green. However, this person who came from afar wore the red and green with liveliness, like the green leaves in midsummer contrasting with the blooming red flowers. Not only was there liveliness, but there was also a hint of enchantment. The instrument she was sitting on was not just any other instrument, it was a red-crowned white crane. The crane spread its huge wings and flew over slowly. The woman's robe also fluttered in the wind. Coupled with the water-like moonlight, she truly looked like a fairy that had descended to the mortal world. The female cultivator quickly arrived outside the inhibition formation, and was only a stone's throw away from the cultivators in the place of the outer fringe. Seeing their doubtful expressions, and some of them even started to cast a spell, she quickly waved her hand on the crane and said, "Stop, stop, I am from Yunshan." Her tone was youthful and lively, which was not common among the ordinary cultivators in Yunshan. Seeing that she did not mean any harm, and her appearance was pleasant, a male cultivator in the place of the outer fringe said, "Fairy, you are from Yunshan? How come I have never heard of such?" At this point he did not know how to describe it. The female cultivator covered her mouth and giggled. "It is normal that you have never seen me before. I am neither Daotong nor Kenzo, but a pitiful girl who does not belong to any sect. I'm just a pitiful girl who doesn't belong to any sect. Where are you going to see me?" The people who did not belong to Daotong or Kenzo on Yunshan were the mortal servants on the mountain. However, this woman could fly in the air, which showed that she was also a cultivator in the place of the outer fringe, and not a mortal. The cultivator who asked the question was puzzled, but someone behind him was startled and said, "She is Taoist priest Danqing." For a moment, everyone was stunned, and then they all quieted down. Taoist priest Danqing was a painting cultivator. There were painting cultivators on Yunshan, but there were very few of them, and they were worshipped by the various grotto heavens. Most of the paintings used by the low-level disciples on Yunshan were created by these painting cultivators. These people's identities were very special. Firstly, their skills were indeed useful. Before the art of painting was completed, there was only one way for cultivators to pass through the tribulation. It was to leave the mountain to train. Now that there was such a simple method, they would not let it die in vain. Chapter 430. However, on the other hand, the art saint joined the devil, and the art sect also became a devil path. It was erased from the history books, and no one was allowed to mention it again. The identity of these Taoist painters was also sensitive. The cultivators of Daotong and Kenzo all had Taoist names, but the Taoist painters didn't have Taoist names. They were only called by their names. These people usually lived like princes, but in fact, there were many restrictions on their words and actions. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were well-treated prisoners. Therefore, many cultivators knew that there were a few Taoist painters on Cloud Mountain, but no one had ever seen them. But now, to suddenly meet such a person on the battlefield outside of Cloudy Mountain, with such a likable appearance and adorable words, how could he not be shocked? Seeing them like this, the female cultivator didn't feel uncomfortable. She jumped down from the crane and landed on the cloud. She grabbed the air with her palm, and the red-crowned crane turned into a small piece of paper and was put into her palm. This was the method of the art sect, and it proved her identity. As soon as she landed, the cultivators closest to her took a few steps back. It was as if this female cultivator had a terrible disease and didn't want to be infected. However, this retreat was just a subconscious action. When they reacted, the female cultivator had already passed through the crowd and walked toward the four masters. She seemed to be used to the reactions of the cultivators and didn't care. However, there was a faint smile on her face, as if she was just walking through a group of fellow disciples. In a few seconds, she walked behind Ku Chanzi and the three True Realm cultivators. She stopped 3 or 4 steps away from them. She didn't salute them, but bowed like a mortal. Mortal girl Xianxilio is a saint, and I have news for sect leader Ku Chanzi. There were naturally female cultivators among the cultivators. However, there was no difference between female and male cultivators in Daotong and Kenzo. They all had to abandon their sexual desires. They were also particular about righteousness. Therefore, in the eyes of mortals, these female cultivators might be beautiful, but they always lacked the charm of a woman. The same group of male cultivators stood together, and at a glance, there was no difference between them. They were all just cultivators. However, this Taoist priest, who called herself Xian Shilio, had a gentle and pleasant voice, and a charming figure. She bowed gracefully. Her temperament was completely different from those female cultivators from the Xianmen sect. On the other hand, many cultivators in the transcendent state, who had yet to go through the love tribulations, were slightly tempted. Then, he heard her claim that she had sent news for the saint. After a moment of shock, he was delighted. Did it mean that the two sages on Cloud Mountain had learned of what happened here, and were enraged? So they asked this female cultivator to send the message, to kill that demon on the spot? Ku Chanzi and the 3 true realm cultivators didn't answer her immediately. After sitting for a while, the Langya Paradise's sect master said, Ling Jizi, ask her what news the saint has sent. Ling Jizi was the name of a transcendent state cultivator, who stood next to Xian Shilio. While the other cultivators had avoided this woman, Ling Jizi had not. It was as if he thought it was beneath his status to let her. However, Ku Chanzi didn't talk to Xian Shilio directly. Instead, he asked her to ask his name. Only then did they remember that Ling Jizi was Ku Chanzi's grand disciple. Ku Chanzi's former disciple was Cheng Kongzi, the sect master of the 9 Heavens Divine Thunder sect in Daotong. Cheng Kongzi was Ling Jizi's Taoist master. A month ago, when several sects raided Lord Dongting Mountain, they used Cheng Kongzi's Dharma treasure to attack Li Yunxin. After that, Cheng Kongzi was killed by Li Yunxin in the wild forest. Now Ling Jizi had lost his master, and only had Ku Chanzi as his grandmaster. Ku Chanzi seemed to disdain talking to Xian Shilio. This was surprising. A profound realm cultivator's heart was like an ancient well. How could he have such a deep prejudice? After receiving the grandmaster's order, Ling Jizi's face turned serious, and he was about to ask Xian Shilio. However, the female cultivator didn't wait for him to ask and said, Sect Master, the sages have announced that the demon Li Yunxin has come to surrender. If there is any conflict, please show some courtesy. Bring him to Cloud Mountain, and the 2 sages will make a decision. When she spoke, she was neither servile nor overbearing, and had a smile on her face. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was very clear. Even Li Yunxin could hear it. When he heard these words, he turned his head and looked at the sky. He saw that Xian Shilio was also looking at him, and she blinked her left eye quickly. This unexpected and playful action stunned Li Yunxin. He didn't even care about the news of the sages that she brought. This woman who called herself Xian Shilio. What's going on? The cultivators outside the restriction were also stunned. They had thought that the sages wanted to kill the demon. They didn't expect that they would be polite to him. The demon had killed the head of a sword sect. How could they be polite to him? For a moment, all the turbulent emotions disappeared. They all held their breaths in silence, and turned their heads to look at Ku Chanzi. They didn't dare to say anything about the news from the sages, so they could only pin their hopes on the sect master of the Langya cave abode. But it was hard to tell whether Ku Chanzi was surprised or not. He was silent for a full 3 breaths before he said, Ask her. Why did she exchange glances with that demon? Before this, almost all the cultivators' eyes were on her. She blinked at Li Yunxin, as if no one else was around, and they all saw it. However, they were so shocked by the news that they didn't have the mood to think about it for a while. Now that Ku Chanzi said so, they realized that it was indeed very strange. Ling Jizi's face darkened, and he was about to ask again. Xian Shilio didn't wait for him and said with a smile, Because I cultivate painting Taoism. I've been on Cloud Mountain for many years, and I haven't seen any fellow disciples. Now that I heard that the demon also cultivates painting Taoism, I feel close to him for no reason. Sect Master, don't you feel close to your fellow disciples? Everyone's expression changed. How dare she say these words in such a dignified manner? This time, before Ku Chanzi could say anything, Ling Jizi poured out his anger for being ignored twice. He frowned and shouted, Close? Do you know that this demon killed the head of the Golden Light sect an hour ago? How could you feel close to such an evil person? It's really. He rarely got angry. Therefore, he couldn't find any appropriate words to express his feelings at this moment. But Xian Shilio twisted her sleeves with her fingers, and covered her mouth, laughing. She lowered her head slightly and rolled her eyes. But I'm a witch of the unorthodox path. It's not strange for me to feel close to a demon. Don't you think so, Sect Master Ku Chanzi? Ling Jizi originally wanted to say that she was a witch of the unorthodox path. However, she was the envoy of the sages, so it was hard to say. Now, this woman admitted it calmly, and she seemed to be quite proud of herself. This made people even more depressed, and they didn't know what to say. At this time, the curiosity and affection the cultivators had for Exa and Shilio were all gone, leaving only disgust. No wonder the Taoists of Xianmen strictly forbade contact with these painting Taoists. Now, what painting Taoists were obviously evil Taoists? Chapter 431. Ku Chanzi finally opened his eyes after hearing her shameless words. But he didn't look at her. He only looked at Li Yunqin from afar. Humph. The sage must have other plans since he can tolerate a witch like you. You are arrogant today, but you will be punished in the future. I won't argue with you for now. But be courteous? He sneered. Even if we are courteous, do you think this demon dares to come out of this prohibition? If you can persuade him and ask him to come out. Humph, it won't be too late for me to make other plans. The three true state cultivators were speechless when they heard this. The Taoist priests and swordsmen in the place of the outer fringe were slightly excited. Master. However, Ku Chanzi stood up and waved his hand. No need to say more. Their conversation was heard by Li Yunqin. Some of it was originally for him to hear. For example, Ku Chanzi's last few words were quite threatening. Su Xing blinked in his sleeve. Do you really dare to go out? Li Yunqin squinted his eyes and stared at Exa and Shilio. This woman's appearance was not outstanding. That was for him. The women he had seen, Bai Yunqin, Ling Kongzi and even Red Lady, were all rare beauties in the world. Now he gave Exa and Shilio an evaluation of not outstanding. If it was in other places, it was enough to be called beautiful like a flower and the moon. Although her appearance was not outstanding, her temperament was especially special. Now that Li Yunqin's state of mind was broken, he was not as cold as before. Therefore, he took a few more glances at her. After hearing Su Sheng's question, he thought for a while. Humph. Ku Chanzi is just being stubborn. It was not that the Taoist priest in the mystic state was afraid of him. He was afraid of the sage. He had experienced how the Taoist priest in Daotong talked about the two sages when he was at the Dongting. At that time, he had just killed Yunzi and reached the true state. He is held hostage by Lord Dongting, a monster in the mysterious realm, and Kun Wuzi, a Taoist in the mysterious realm. However, he took advantage of the situation and used the excuse that the jade slip was related to the secrets of the two saints to scare Kun Wuzi into throwing the jade slip back to him. It could be seen that Daodong Xianjing Taoist was truly in awe of the two sages. Now that Ku Chanzi was sitting in Kun Wuzi's previous position, there shouldn't be any difference. But there was one thing. Who knew if those people were acting or not? For example, he could get a female cultivator from somewhere and have her disguise as Taoist painting priest Exa and Shilio. Then, he would put on a show with this group of people, pretending that he had no choice but to obey the saint's order to trick him out. Then he suddenly changed his expression, laughed out loud 3 times, and blasted them to smithereens on the spot. If it were him, he would have done so. Thus he gently shook his head. But let's just take a look. After saying this, Exa and Shilio bowed to Ku Chanzi again. She seemed to be thanking the lord of the Langya cave abode for being reasonable and giving her this opportunity. Then, she turned to look at Li Yunqin, and Li Yunqin also looked at her. After looking at each other for 2 breaths, Exa and Shilio opened her mouth and said with a smile, "You demon, why don't you come out? Are you afraid that it's a trap?" Li Yunqin didn't say anything. The female cultivator said again, "Why don't you think about why you didn't die tonight? What's there to be afraid of when you see me?" To the cultivators, there was nothing to criticize about her words. They were just weak persuasion. However, to Li Yunqin, the fingers under his big sleeves moved slightly. There was a hidden meaning in his words. Exa and Shilio had made the cultivators angry and speechless with just a few words, which showed that she was sharp-tongued. So at this time, To persuade an extremely vigilant demon, every word must be carefully thought out, and there would be no need to mix in some unimportant nonsense. But she added the word inexplicable. This phrase was worth pondering. In the eyes of the people of the celestial sect, it was probably understood as the demon was surrounded well, and suddenly a Taoist priest in painting came, and inexplicably wanted to let the demon go. However, to Li Yunqin, he felt that it should refer to something else. If one were to talk about inexplicable things, the most inexplicable thing that happened to him tonight was the sudden gathering of a sufficiently strong power of will from the Wei River, pushing him to the level of a perfected master in one go. Otherwise, he would have to spend more effort to kill the golden light, and he wouldn't be so relaxed now. Is this what she is referring to? He calmed himself down. His face was calm, but he had already paid attention to what she was going to say next. Seeing that he didn't respond, Xian Shilio sighed. Okay, you don't trust me, but don't you trust the people who sent me here? Now that you think about it, don't you think you've done what they promised you? Hearing this, Li Yunqin's pupils suddenly dilated, and he almost frowned. How could this little girl be so bold? He heard her say, inexplicable before, and she was thinking about the burning incense at Wei River. So he knew that maybe Mu Nanja's people made a move tonight and cooperated with him. So he thought, could this little girl be Mu Nanja's spy in the celestial sect? This idea was shocking and bold enough, but it wasn't impossible. The Freemasonry could almost control the celestial sect, and Mu Nanju, who had been secretly competing with them, didn't have any clever tricks. It was reasonable for the two sides to send spies to each other. Unexpectedly, as soon as he had this idea, Xian Shilio said, the people who sent me here, and what they promised you. The people who sent her here were the two sages, and the two sages, but they didn't promise anything to him, Li Yunqin. Then, the hidden meaning was in line with his bold conjecture, wasn't it? Mu Nanju had promised him to subdue Wei River for him. Didn't she mean the two sages but Mu Nanju's people? But she said it so openly, just like how she had admitted that she was a demonic woman of the unorthodox path before. How dare she? Her words not only surprised Li Yunqin, but also surprised Ku Chanzi and the other cultivators. The Langya Cave Abode Master frowned and shouted, what are you talking about? Who? What's the matter? The Profound Realm Masters felt that something was wrong, so they were on guard. The pressure from this was unbearable for ordinary people. But Xian Shilio's expression didn't change. She just smiled faintly and said, do you want to ask me about this? Of course, I'm talking about the sages. The saint had already talked to this demon before, and even promised him a few things. If you don't believe me, you can ask the sages yourself. Only Li Yunqin knew that what she said to Ku Chanzi was all nonsense. This woman, in front of so many cultivators, she directly put the blame on the two sages, and her expression didn't change. Who would believe that she was lying? This kind of psychological quality, he took a deep breath. How come he had never heard of such a person before? Hearing her words, Ku Chanzi froze for a moment, and then turned his face away from her. It seemed that he had known Xian Shilio before, and now he believed her words. Chapter 432. Ignoring the uproar of the cultivators behind her, Xian Shilio looked at Li Yunqin again. Demon, since you are willing to forsake the darkness for the light, tonight is a great opportunity for you. You call yourself the Wei River Dragon King, but it's just an empty title. Whether you can become a king or a marquis depends on whether you can seize the opportunity tonight. Are you still going to hesitate and wait for this Ku Chanzi to kill you? 3 breaths later, Li Yunqin gently waved his sleeve, put Su Sheng away and stood up. Xian Shilio was indeed a spy of Nanmuju lurking in Xianmen. He had made sure of it. Become a king or a marquis? The master of Nanmuju had asked Bai Emo to pass a message to him, saying that the current battle was the battle of the marquis between the major forces. With his strength alone, he was not qualified to participate in this battle. He had asked Bai Emo to reply to the master of Nanmuju, saying that he would talk about cooperation with Nanmuju during the battle for the throne. Now, Xian Shilio's become a king or a marquis. was simply the most straightforward way to express what had happened that day. This was the third code word. She had used this method to eliminate all the uncertainties, and clearly told herself that she was a member of Nanmaju. This woman was courageous, meticulous, and cunning. He stood up. Ku Chanzi's expression changed slightly, and the other cultivators were also surprised. It was hard to imagine that someone could persuade this demon so easily with just 3 sentences. One should know how fierce this guy was. Although Su Sheng was kept in his sleeve, he still asked, "Are you really going out?" Li Yunxin squinted at Xian Shilio for a while, and said in a low voice, "I have a good reason to believe that she is an ally. The reason to believe that Ku Chanzi will not kill me is also good enough. I can't hide here forever. Moreover, there is no perfect thing in this world. What about you?" After saying this, he raised his hand and slowly pointed in the void. Every time he touched it, there would be a mysterious light, and a fine, indistinct pattern would appear around it. It was like a spider web. Thus, the 36 ghosts behind him gradually shrank, and finally became 36 small light spots, all of which melted into the palm of his right hand. 36 tiny golden stars formed an extremely faint ring in the center of his palm. When Su Sheng saw this, he seemed to be slightly surprised. "You refine it?" The golden light refined the golden swords transformed from 36 ghosts into the ocean of qi and mountain of snow, but it was pulled out, and its cultivation was greatly damaged. She had thought that this was a lesson to be learned from the mistakes of others, but who knew that Li Yunxin would do the same thing now? Although it was not refined into the qi si, it was roughly refined into the zhongzhu and higa acupoints, which could be considered as deeply entering the divine soul. He was a demon. If he had enough wish power, it would be easy for his cultivation to soar. Moreover, Su Sheng knew that he was full of tricks, so it would not be difficult for him to swindle some incense and wish power. Besides, he was a demon among the demons, and his body was extremely strong. Why did he have to refine a magic treasure into his soul and leave a weak point? Li Yunxin did not answer him. With a flip of his left hand, he took out a few other treasures. They were the deity cloak, the cloud collecting platform, the Tiandi mirror, and the world mirror. These 4 treasures formed a Dao treasure, and were his spoils of war tonight. And at this moment, in front of the many cultivators of the celestial sect of wonders outside the light barrier, bit by bit, these 4 treasures of the celestial sect of wonders were completely refined into his own soul. No one made a sound, because they knew that even if they angrily scolded and threatened him, they would not be able to stop this demon from doing this. Instead, it would weaken their morale. Thus, they could only suppress the surging anger and regret in their hearts, almost causing internal injuries. The only thing they could use to comfort themselves was, "It's not good to be greedy, Li Yunxin." Su Sheng saw that he was doing all this, and couldn't help but remind him. In the secular world, carpenters, masons, and masons all had a threshold to enter the profession, not to mention Taoist treasures. Daotong and Kenzo cultivators had focused on Taoist techniques for hundreds of years, and with tens of thousands of years of experience and the guidance of famous teachers, they could finally control magic treasures with ease. This kind of experience was not something that could be complemented by the words, heavenly genius. Li Yunxin's perception on the path of cultivation was extremely high, but just like before, he only dared to pick a few divine abilities from the translucent jade slip to learn. This Dao treasure formed by 4 sage treasures, he could not immediately use it with ease. Even if Su Sheng, who was once a sage, had already taught him the essence of controlling these treasures in a concise manner. But right now, he seemed to only want to roughly refine them, and not to master them. In fact, apart from the glazed sword heart that he could control, the other 4 could only be considered to have been refined into his soul. If he were to really use them against an enemy, it would instead cause him to be flustered. With his talent, it would be very difficult to use them without a few years of practice. But Li Yunxin still remained silent. After half an hour, when all these things were done, he asked again, "Then, do you want to go up Cloud Mountain with me or?" After a while, Su Sheng said in his sleeve, "I'm not as adventurous as you are." Li Yunxin abruptly swung his sleeve. The layer of mysterious light outside the glazed sword heart was removed by him. In an instant, a deafening noise resounded, and a gust of wind blew. The airflow between heaven and earth immediately filled this huge bubble. The gust of wind coming from all directions collided in this space, stirring up an even more terrifying cyclone. The slightly solidified rocks and unsolidified magma were all swept up into the sky, and a huge amount of heat and smoke were thrown in all directions. A black tornado of several hundred meters high took shape, and in just 3 breaths of time, it plowed a terrifying deep hole where Li Yunxin was standing. But he had already flown out. In just 1 breath of time, he had already fled to the front of nearly 100 profound gate cultivators. Above the sky, the gust of wind blew. The cultivators' sleeves fluttered in the air, but their bodies did not move. The monster Li Yunxin was a stone's throw away from them, and he did not move either. Their gazes met, and the collision of their gazes could almost create sparks in this cold autumn night. Some transcendent state cultivators were eager to try, but Ku Chanzi did not make a move, so they could only endure. After the stalemate lasted for a dozen breaths, Ku Chanzi gently took a breath and turned to look at Xianxilio. He turned to look at Xianxilio and said, "I will ask the 2 sages whether what you said is true or not." Xianxilio smiled. "You don't have to report to me." Ku Chanzi's expression did not change. However, his left hand, which was behind his back, turned slightly and pointed again. A talisman made of mysterious light appeared out of thin air and imprinted on Xianxilio's sleeve. "If you're not going to Mount Yun, this talisman can protect your body and soul." Xianxilio was still smiling. "Thank you, master." Ku Chanzi did not say anything else, and he flew into the sky. Once he left, the 3 true state cultivators also left without saying a word. The remaining nearly 100 transcendent state cultivators were still glaring at Li Yunxin. At this moment they looked slightly panicked. When Li Yunxin suddenly smiled evilly and leaned forward, the group of people immediately rode on all kinds of magic treasures to escape, as if they were competing. Chapter 433. Only Li Yunxin and Xianxilio were left in the night sky. After a moment of silence, Li Yunxin shook his head and said, "Little girl, you are really bold." Xianxilio smiled slightly and said, "I'm not as bold as Dragon King. I've heard a lot about Dragon King from my master. He's probably the hero in the hearts of all the girls in the world." She called Li Yunxin Dragon King, which was indeed what people in Mu Nanju called him. Li Yunxin smiled and said, "So now shall we go to Yunshan?" Xianxilio tilted her head and said, "Doesn't Dragon King want to know what happened at Weishui River tonight? I'm a great hero, so I have to be magnanimous. How can I ask questions as soon as I see him?" Li Yunxin turned his body slightly and stretched out a hand. "Please." His behavior was called gentlemanly in his previous world, although it was not so particular here. Sometimes body language was always the same. Xianxilio understood and smiled again. She seemed to think it was also very interesting, so she turned around happily. The 2 of them flew in the sky side by side and went higher. Just like that they soared. When the ground was far away, and the fire on the ground was only a small dot of light, they turned and went northwest. At this moment Li Yunxin asked, "So, what happened at Weishui River tonight?" "It was only a quarter of an hour." Xianxilio heard his question and laughed. "So Dragon King is so impatient." High up in the sky, the wind was fierce and the temperature was extremely low. Li Yunxin was a demon, so he was not afraid of such cold and wind. Xianxilio was a human, so she summoned the red-crowned white crane. As soon as the crane appeared, the surrounding cold wind was immediately repelled. The 2 of them were immediately wrapped in a ball of warmth, as if they were bathing in the spring night. Li Yunxin was silent for a moment. He looked at the crane she was sitting on. "Is this the crane in the pine and crane prolonging life painting?" For example, teachers in the secular world would always have a few examples to teach them how to read and write. When it came to the art of painting, there were also some paintings that were often used to teach new students. Paintings like the eternal pine and crane painting were commonly used by painters in the secular world. Taoists in painting also used them. When Li Yunxin was young, his parents had taught him the same thing. But now, he saw this familiar thing. In fact, it was a slightly complicated feeling. He used to think that he was the only one in the world who cultivated the art of painting. After becoming a demon, he was also alone, his shadow hanging by itself. But tonight, this young lady who also cultivated in the painting Tao had suddenly appeared. Furthermore, she had said something about being friendly, and was on the same front as him. For a moment he felt a little emotional. It was like walking in the vast wilderness, and suddenly meeting one of their own. Moreover, compared to the art saint, who was well known but illusory, this kind of person was very vivid. Xian Shilyo winked a little playfully and patted the back of the white crane lightly. Dragon King is a master of painting. Could it be that my methods are also worthy of your discerning eyes? Very good. Li Yunxin commented briefly. Xian Shilyo smiled again. Then I will have the confidence to tell Dragon King what happened tonight. Dragon King should know that we have already subdued the Wei River for you. We have also made arrangements in many places, and are ready to act at any time. We are just waiting for a word from Dragon King. When she said this, there was still a smile in her eyes. She was very much like a lively young lady. Now that she had seen her favorite hero, joy flowed from her eyes. But Li Yunxin only nodded. Who would believe that she was just a lively young lady? That kind of young lady could not be a spy of Mu Nanju. Sneak into Xianmen, no. Sneak into the Freemasonry, and get close to the fake saint. Such a woman's thoughts must be extremely terrifying. Under this beautiful appearance, perhaps there is a heart of a snake and scorpion. Li Yunxin said to himself in his heart. Then he let out a light breath. He observed her carefully while listening to her continue. So tonight, in all the temples along the Wei River, the Wei River Dragon King's 100-foot dragon body appeared at the same time and rain fell. Xian Shilyo said slowly, at the same time looking at Li Yunxin's expression. And our people stirred up the public opinion everywhere. When the people saw this, how could they have any other thoughts? They naturally believed it without a doubt. But tonight, for the sake of the Dragon King, many of the spies that had been planted long ago had appeared. Some of them will be used as spies in the future, and some can't be used anymore. Roughly estimating, it involves no less than 10,000 people. Maybe more than 1,000 people will die. Xian Shilyo sighed in a low voice. And all this is just to help Dragon King succeed tonight. There was only a faint smile on Li Yunxin's face, and no emotion could be seen. Hearing what she said, he thought for a moment. You are a painter. So the 100-foot dragon body was painted by you? It's a shame. Xian Shilyo pursed her lips and smiled, looking down at Li Yunxin. There was a hint of shyness in the smile between her eyebrows. But this shyness was not hidden like that of ordinary women. Instead, it was exposed, which made her strangely attractive. Now that I'm closer and have a closer look at you, Dragon King, I realize how handsome you are. Before this, I only saw Dragon King once from afar. Those original paintings of the 100-foot dragon body were made by me thinking about that side. Before this, they were stored everywhere along the Wei River, waiting to be used. Looking at them now, how can they compare to you now? You've seen me before. Li Yunxin frowned slightly. It was not a good feeling to know that such a woman had secretly observed him. When I was in Chengdu, I saw you from afar. At that time, there was a dog-headed Taoist beside you. Xian Shilyo said this in a slightly proud tone. It was the kind of cute showing off of a girl, and it was not annoying. Ah, Li Yunxin smiled. But why did you help me tonight? I remember I said, it's not really helping Dragon King. It's helping ourselves. Xian Shilyo combed her hair behind her ear, and her expression became more serious. It seemed that what she was about to say next was a paraphrase of someone's words, and she was very respectful of that person, so she became serious. My master said that he was very negligent when he saw Dragon King for the first time. The second time he saw Dragon King, he also accidentally messed up. So I know that Dragon King is a proud person, and he doesn't like free gifts or charity. So in the future, I probably have to do good things without asking for rewards. This time, it's not to help Dragon King. But, we found a Freemasonry spy among us. Li Yunxin raised his eyebrows slightly. Oh, but we can't find out who it is. We arranged for some people to sneak into the Freemasonry, but someone was instigated. Now we only found something unusual, but we can't find out who it is. So, I need to find that person. Then I have to do a lot more things. Those things can't be covered up by ordinary means. So I need a good excuse. Dragon King made a big scene here tonight, so we will cooperate with Dragon King this time, to send Dragon King to Yunshan. In this way, Dragon King also practices painting, and I also practice painting. I'm also an unorthodox witch. In the future, it's reasonable to act a little absurd on Yunshan. So, she turned to look at Li Yunxin. It's not helping Dragon King. It's asking for help from Dragon King. Li Yunxin was silent for a while, and suddenly laughed. He laughed and shook his head. Xi and Shilyo didn't know what he was laughing about. Then Li Yunxin sighed. How should I put these things? For example, two people get along. Some people seem to hit it off, and no matter what, they feel comfortable to be together. That's the saying, no discord, no concord. As for some people, they shouldn't be together in the first place. So, no matter how carefully they try to get along, they always feel that something is wrong. Actually, you don't need to be like this. Li Yunxin smiled and shook his head. Everything is too calculative, and you can't look smooth. It will make people uncomfortable. For example, your style of doing things. You always like to lay out the pros and cons. You probably think that's how I do things. I'm this kind of person, and I like this kind of style. But in fact, I prefer, to be a little more hypocritical and beautiful. This way, no one will be embarrassed. After saying these words, he paused. But since you've already done this, if I don't give you face, it'll be too impolite. Tell me, what do you want me to do? Xi and Shilyo looked at him, and was slightly relieved. She hurriedly said, In my master's place, there's nothing to ask Dragon King to do. Dragon King can go to Yunshan, and do what he wants to do. I just need to borrow the power of Dragon King. She said this, but it seemed that she didn't have enough. Li Yunxin asked, What about in your place? Xi and Shilyo blinked, and the expression on her face softened. It seemed that after talking about her master, she began to talk about her own matters. In my place. She gently bit her lips. The illumination jade slip of the Holy Bible of painting is in the hands of Dragon King. Dragon King is a genius in this field. I hope that Dragon King can teach me. Li Yunxin's heart jumped slightly. The reasons that Xi and Shilyo said just now were all valid. I hope to borrow the power of Dragon King to find out the spy, and so on. But he always felt that Mu Nanja's purpose should be more than this. Now that this little girl said this, an obvious warning sign appeared in his heart. She mentioned the name of the illumination jade slip. This was the first time they met, and she mentioned this almost taboo thing. This would make him suspicious. And like now, he would focus all his attention on this matter. But, what if the other party also thought of this? What if she wanted to use the illumination jade slip to attract his attention? In fact, she wanted to take the opportunity to plot something else. But what plot? Li Yunxin didn't know if he thought too much. But he suppressed the emotion in his heart, and smiled sideways. There are also painting cultivators in Yunshan. How do you inherit it? Are you from Munanju? Are you already or? Li Yunxin didn't answer her. And the little girl seemed to be a little disappointed. And the disappointment was written on her face. She opened her mouth. Did I say something wrong? I didn't. I didn't have other ideas. And I didn't want to do anything. She defended herself, as if she felt that the more she explained, the more she made things worse. She said and laughed vexedly, as though she were angry with herself. All right. Lao Wang is right. You can't talk casually with Dragon King. Every word should be in your stomach 3 times. And when it reaches your throat, you should swallow it. Only when you feel that there is nothing wrong can you say it. Li Yunxin smiled, but didn't say anything. Xi and Shilyo said, Oh, okay. I will tell Dragon King first. The Taoist priests in Yunshan are selected from the mortals of Yunshan. Dragon King. Do you know that there are a lot of mortals on Yunshan? About every 50 years, some people will be sent down, and some will be selected. I think there are tens of thousands of mortals on the mountain now. Among so many mortals, there must be some who are suitable for cultivation. I was selected because of this. At this time, they didn't know how far they had flown. Looking down, the ground was dark. Occasionally, there were sporadic light spots, which seemed to be the towns where humans lived. However, they were as small as sparks, and almost couldn't be seen clearly. Li Yunqin thought for a while. So, you are from Munanju, so you were coincidentally chosen? Xan Shilio smiled. Dragon King laughed at me. I was not chosen because I was from Munanju. It was because I was chosen. And I happened to be from Munanju. She paused for a while. There are many of us on Yunshan, and among those mortals. 18 years ago, there were more than 2,000 children of the right age to learn painting. Dragon King, can you guess how many of these 2,000 people are our people? Li Yunqin thought for a while. A quarter? Xian Shilio smiled. Dragon King is really smart. A quarter. The mortals on Yunshan go in and out once every 50 years. Our people have been there for a long time. My birth parents are both from Munanju. After I was chosen, I became the chief steward of Yunshan. That is to say, Li Yunqin frowned slightly. If there are 50,000 people on Yunshan, there are more than 10,000 of you? For him, this was an unimaginable number. 10,000 people was comparable to the regular army of some small countries. Xian Shilio saw through his thoughts. The people on Yunshan, our people may be slightly different from what Dragon King thinks. She raised her hand and pointed to the sky. In the eyes of cultivators, mortals are not really people. They rarely care about what mortals think, and they don't need to care about what mortals think. Dragon King, think about it. What kind of life do mortals live? She counted with her fingers and said bit by bit. Many people have problems eating and wearing warm clothes. The so-called rich can only eat some fine grains for a few days every month. But there are many things on Yunshan. Therefore, cultivators will not be like the masters of the secular world, who keep a close eye on their servants. They don't care about the things mortals care about. What they really treasure, mortals can't use, and secondly, they don't dare to use. The only thing they have to guard against is the scriptures. But those things, it is very difficult for mortals to get them. Therefore, cultivators don't care about many things these tens of thousands of people do. Then, Dragon King should know that where there are many people, there will be Jianghu. Tens of thousands of people will not live in harmony. There will always be many forces that will divide them from the inside. This was probably the first time Li Yunqin came into contact with the internal affairs of Munanju, but it was from the little girl that he met for the first time. She claimed that she was chosen to learn painting 18 years ago, so she should be around 18 or 19 years old now. 18 or 19 years old to learn painting. She didn't have that many scriptures, and she didn't have a reliable master, but she had already reached the state of transcendent. This reminded him of Lingkongzi. This cloud mountain was truly a galaxy of talents. Perhaps there would be some even more talented people who would be buried for the rest of their lives. But Li Yunqin was very smart. After listening to what she said, he understood most of it. He pondered for a moment, then said, "You mean to say that these people will form cliques and factions? For example, the people in Jing City will talk about the Qingzhou gang, the Liangzhou gang, and so on. But they don't care. Not everyone in these gangs knows that they are from the Freemasonry. Only some of the leaders and managers are your people. You can control a few points, and at the same time, it will be easier to keep secrets." Xian Shilio smiled and said, "Dragon King, you are so smart." Her smile was indeed the merry, innocent smile of a pretty girl. This caused Li Yunqin to have some thoughts in her heart. Previously, he thought that this woman might be scheming and a terrifying opponent. He had been secretly observing Xian Shilio's expression just now, trying to find any trace of abnormality. But to his surprise, there was nothing wrong with this girl's expression. Everything was normal. It seemed that every frown, every smile, every word, and every action of hers were sincere. This was the second time he had seen this. The first time was with the Zither Master. The Zither Master was a profound realm great demon with a high cultivation level. He was able to plant a restriction on himself without him knowing. In his eyes, there was nothing unusual, but it meant that he was terrifyingly shrewd. It was not something others could estimate. After all, he had lived for a long time. It was reasonable for him to be so cunning. If Li Yunqing couldn't see it, it meant that he was not powerful enough. At first, he thought that although Xian Shilio looked like a young and beautiful girl, she was actually more than 100 years old. It was normal for her to be cunning, but now he knew that she was only 18 or 19 years old. An 18 or 19-year-old. No matter how much he had experienced or how much he had seen, it was impossible for him to escape his discerning eyes. This was his confidence in himself. If he didn't have this confidence, he would have died a long time ago. But was it true? He began to realize that the people he dealt with were always bad guys. Whether they were smart or stupid, they always had many tricks up their sleeves. He had been dealing with such people, and gradually, he didn't believe that there were really pure and innocent people. Although it was a life-saving skill and a way to survive, it was also very sad. Thinking of this, he sighed in a low voice. You are a spy of Mu Nanju. At such a young age, you could not show any flaws in front of a fake sage. You are very capable. The things you've done all these years can be written into a legend. Didn't you panic when you faced the Freemasons? Xian Shilio was stunned for a moment, and then laughed. Oh, it's my fault. I forgot to tell you. I am also a member of the Freemasons. Chapter 434. Li Yunqing was slightly stunned. Huh? Xian Shilio pointed to herself. 18 years ago, a total of 20 children were selected to be Taoist painters, 4 of us. Dragon King also knows that the paintings we made are very useful. So, more than 20 of us Taoist painters were pulled into the Freemasonry. More than 20 of us are now nominally members of the Freemasonry. Daotong and Kinzo don't know about it. And among these 20 people, I don't know who the other 3 people are from Mu Nanju. It's always been like this. I'm afraid that one person's identity will be exposed and implicate others. Dragon King also knows that cultivators' methods of extorting confessions are different from mortals. It's not like they can't say anything if they don't want to. Li Yunqing nodded. So, there seems to be a traitor among us. Xian Shilio frowned, looking very angry at the person who betrayed Mu Nanju. Among the 2 people besides me, one was instigated to defect. We know about this through some clues, but we still don't know how much the traitor revealed. This matter must be explained, otherwise there will be endless troubles. Li Yunqing thought for a moment and couldn't help but chuckle. But there was a hint of surprise in his laughter. That is to say, you are now a double-sided spy. You were born in Mu Nanju, but you were absorbed by the Freemasonry. Tonight, you can work for the fake holy sage, because of this identity? Xian Shilio looked a little proud. Yes. Then, the one who was instigated to defect is even more powerful. Li Yunqing smiled and shook his head again. He was born in Mu Nanju, entered Xianmen, and was absorbed by the Freemasonry. Then he was instigated to defect by the Freemasonry, and became a spy of the Freemasonry. This is a 3-sided spy. But you still don't know who this person is. So I must find him. Xian Shilio raised her eyebrows and said angrily. At this point, Li Yunqing's face looked relaxed, but her heart tightened. There were still no flaws. When talking about such a complicated topic, one's emotions would change several times in a single sentence. Under such circumstances, it was difficult for him to hide his emotions perfectly, but he still couldn't see any flaws. So he smiled and sighed, all right. Now I know that you have your reasons. So, what do you want me to teach you? Xian Shilio was stunned for a moment, and then she jumped up happily. The white crane under her let out a long cry of dissatisfaction, which sounded like the sound of Bai Yunqing when she showed her real body. I'll learn whatever Dragon King teaches me, she said happily. Those Taoist priests and swordsmen of Mount Yunshan always say that they are orthodox and I am heretical. In my opinion, Dragon King should just start a new sect. The jade slip of enlightenment is in your hands, and you are the #1 painter in the world. You can be the new art saint, and I will be your first disciple. Whether it was sincere or not, this was indeed a happy expression that Li Yunqing rarely saw in others. So he shook his head and smiled. Not everyone can be a saint. One has to be in the Taishang realm. As for starting a sect, Now that Daotong and Kinzo are still here, it will be very troublesome. I don't like to be followed by a group of people. Speaking of this, he suddenly remembered. It seemed to be a long time ago, but in fact it was not that long ago. He accepted 4 disciples in the house of the Chiao family in city of Wei 5. At that time, he just thought it was interesting and gave them some names. However, those little demons were also very diligent and behaved like disciples. But now they were all scattered and withered. 2 of them died. 1 was still imprisoned in Mount Yunshan. 1 was seriously injured and was with Yu Meng. The other one, Xiao Jessen's wandering soul. He didn't know where she was now. She worked with the 2 dead demons and now, he didn't know how she was. He suddenly felt a little dull. He smiled again. I don't have time to teach you. In a dozen days, Mount Yunshan will land, and Xianmen will start a war with the demons. At that time, I might not even be able to protect myself. Do you think your master is willing to let you go with me? Xian Shilio was stunned. Suddenly, her cheeks turned red, almost imperceptible. But she quickly tried to find a topic to cover up. Dragon King is so powerful. He will have a way. It is said that Dragon King used to be a human, and later became Dragon King. If it were me, I would also. She stopped and said embarrassedly. Did I ask something I shouldn't have asked again? Li Yunxin was silent for a while, and suddenly smiled. Nothing. Xian Shilio didn't know whether he was being perfunctory or sincere. Just when she was about to say something, she saw Li Yunxin turn his palm and suddenly throw something to her. Without hesitation, she immediately reached out to take it. Li Yunxin saw her action. Even now his expression was still normal. Then, Xian Shilio saw the thing in his palm. Her reaction? She was in a trance for a moment. She didn't know what it was. Then she was stunned. It seemed that a bold speculation suddenly appeared in her heart, but she didn't dare to believe it was true. Then a trace of fear floated in her heart. That bold speculation made her a little scared. If Li Yunxin was not wrong, after the fear, there was a moment of worry about personal gains and losses. It was like a sensitive girl guessing the sudden feelings of a strange man. However, this kind of emotion was quickly suppressed by an even grander and more solemn emotion. All the previous reactions were her own, and the next reaction was based on the power and position she belonged to. Dragon King, what does this mean? Her expression became serious, and her tone became exactly the same as when she told Li Yunxin about her master's words. That was because the transparent object in her hands was, it seemed to be the jade slip of enlightenment. Li Yunxin frowned. It was still flawless, so he paused and looked at Xian Shilio. This is the jade slip of enlightenment, a holy book of painting. Don't you want to see this thing? Of course he wanted to. Which painter wouldn't want to? However, how many disasters had this thing caused? In the past few months, the Taoist masters of the Xianmen had fallen one after another, and there were also casualties among the great demons. Not to mention the mortals who were affected like ants that no one cared about, and the general trend of the world being in turmoil. Although it couldn't be said that it was all because of this jade slip of enlightenment, it was definitely related to it. It could almost be said that this thing was the fuse that detonated all of this. At this time, it was almost a hot potato. Strong people with supernatural power could try to fight for it. If people with low cultivation got it, it was just a talisman that would hasten their lives. Xian Shilio held it, as if she was holding a fragile crystal. This is Dragon King's treasure. How dare I accept it? She seemed to be trying hard to calm herself down. Shilio said something wrong before Dragon King. Don't make fun of me. I'm not joking, Li Yunxin said seriously. Now I'm going to the fake sage. The 2 of them have always wanted my jade slip of enlightenment. If I bring it with me, it's equivalent to giving it to them for free. It's better to give it to you. He looked at Xian Shilio with a solemn expression. You'll keep it for the time being. In their eyes, you're one of them, and there's no reason for them to hide it. They won't search you, right? At this point he paused. Xian Shilio was stunned for a while before saying, No. And you're from Munanju? Li Yunxin continued and smiled at the same time. You just said some reasons for your people to help me. After I heard it, I thought about it and felt that it made sense. But I also feel that you should have some other considerations. Although the Freemasonry and I have a feud of killing my parents, everyone knows that I, Li Yunqin, am a sinister and cunning person, right? Xian Shilio hurriedly opened her mouth to speak, but Li Yunqin waved his hand and stopped her. So if I can go up to Cloud Mountain alive, the Freemasonry will think that I have value and want to recruit me. It's not impossible for me to take shelter with them for the time being. You've thought of this, haven't you? That's why you helped me and made your attitude clear. Alas, Li Yunqin smiled. It's also the result I expected at the beginning. I came here to make a scene, and once the Freemasonry showed any intention of recruiting me, you guys would definitely not sit still and help me. At the same time, it also confirmed my other guess. You also have eyes and ears inside the Freemasonry. Xian Shilio just blinked and did not speak. So now I give this thing to you as a return for a plum. The so-called reason that you guys helped me tonight, and only asked to use my identity to move freely, sounds like a free favor to me. I'm not a fool. As long as you start to treat our relationship seriously, I'm willing to give you enough goodwill. This thing, just take it as my goodwill. After a while, Xian Shilio said awkwardly, but this, if the Dragon King is really handed to me, I will definitely not hide it. Such an important thing. Shilio has to hand it over to the master. Then hand it over. Li Yunqin said indifferently. Only I know the method to open this thing. It doesn't matter whose hands it is in. Xian Shilio was speechless for a while, looking at Li Yunqin's eyes. In addition to doubt and surprise, there was also a trace of other emotions. It was very rare to see a handsome person like him. Before she met Li Yunqin, the rumors about this Wei River Dragon King seemed to mainly focus on words like cunning, fierce, and ruthless. But now that she saw him with her own eyes, although she knew that he was indeed different from ordinary people, she also slowly realized that this living person seemed to be even more different from the rumors. It seemed, how was he cunning and fierce? He was more like an upright and magnanimous person. At least, it was impossible for there to be a second person in this world who would casually give something like the enlightened jade slip to another girl whom he met for the first time. Xian Shilio seemed to be speechless because of such feelings. So Li Yunqin didn't say anything more for the time being. The two of them flew straight to the northwest, but they didn't fly directly to Cloud Mountain. If that was the case, it might take dozens of days. Xian Shilio seemed to have another way. The reason why he walked with Li Yunqin earlier was because he wanted to have time to talk. And Li Yunqin was very satisfied with her reaction. From the time he met her until now, it had only been more than an hour. At first it was fear, then hesitation. As for now, he wanted to dig something out from Xian Shilio. She claimed to be a double agent of the Freemasonry and Mu Nanju, so she must have a lot of information. When Li Yunqin dealt with them before, he could only watch from afar, so it was difficult for him to find a breakthrough. Now he finally found it, and he found two at once. If the identity of this girl was really as she said, in fact, he could use some other means to get her to say a lot of things he was interested in. Li Yunqin knew that he had a terrifying advantage in a certain aspect, especially for a girl who was inexperienced in the emotional aspect. So he threw the enlightened jade slip to her. This thing was obviously not a creation of this world, but the former art saint had great magical powers, and he had made some kind of transformation with the method of this world. Therefore, this thing also had the characteristics of the real jade slips in this world. Otherwise, why would the two sages and many high-level cultivators in the past all call it jade slip of enlightenment, when they had all seen it? Therefore, the so-called enlightened jade slip could leave one's aura. The cultivators of the Xianmen also used the jade slips to record the essence of their experience. Then they left a mark on the slip with their own spiritual aura, so they could roughly know where the jade slip was and whether it was damaged. Of course, it was not as accurate and mysterious as the so-called location in his previous world, but at least they could know whether the jade slip was in the west, north, or northwest. On the other hand, the mark he left was performed with the method of painting Tao. It was the most suitable supernatural power for the cultivators of the true state to practice. If he wanted to break the mark he left, he would immediately know whether it was the method of painting Tao, or some other method to break it by force. He wanted to further confirm whether Xinshilio was from Mu Nanju, as she claimed to be. The whereabouts of the enlightened jade slip could be used as proof. And the people of Mu Nanju called themselves the former subordinates of the art saint. So he could also know whether there were any experts who practiced painting Tao among them. Moreover, his realm was already very high. There were fewer and fewer methods in the enlightened jade slip that he could use. What he was in urgent need of was not advanced magic arts, but a more fundamental and systematic training method related to the art of painting. As for the so-called secret of ascension, hidden in the enlightened jade slip, no one had found it in 1,000 years, not to mention in a short period of time. If the Freemasonry turned their attention to Mu Nanju, he might be able to relieve some pressure. Of course, there was a more important purpose. However, that goal was too vague and elusive. It was just a thought. There was also a more important reason for him to hand over the enlightened jade slip at this moment. But that reason, Li Yunxin did not want to think about it now, because it was one of his trump cards that he was not afraid of during this period of time. He had almost used this trump card a few times before. Now that he had come to this step, he really hoped that things could develop according to the trajectory he expected, to let him fight for himself, at least for a short period of time to rest and lick his wounds. They traveled like this for another 15 minutes. Finally, Xinshilio carefully put away the enlightened jade slip. She stopped and looked at Li Yunxin. Dragon King. Is there anything else you want to tell me? I have a magic weapon that can travel 100,000 miles a day. We can use it to go. But in that case, there won't be time for Dragon King to say anything in detail. Perhaps the saying, taking someone else's gift, was also appropriate for cultivators. Or perhaps there were some other feelings in his heart. Xinshilio's expression when talking to Li Yunxin was different from before. There was respect from before, but a hint of shyness seemed to be there as well. Li Yunxin looked at her gently. His voice was also gentle. I'd like to fly slowly with you. After saying this, he paused intentionally. Xinshilio pursed her lips and smiled. It's also good. I can study the painting path with you on the way. Li Yunxin blinked. His beautiful eyes sparkled under the moonlight. He looked very charming and unrestrained. But I'm afraid that the people on Mount Yunshan will be too anxious to wait for us and ruin our plan again. Let's go there early and see what happens. He lowered his thick and dense eyelashes, thought for a moment, and looked at Xinshilio again. I'm also very happy to have a kindred spirit. Xinshilio was stunned for a while because of his gaze. But soon she turned her face and blinked with twinkling eyes. Ah! How dare Shilio and Dragon King be together? Ouch! She seemed to be a little flustered. She stuttered a few words, but couldn't find a suitable word. Ordinary girls would probably be more shy and flustered at this time. But this Xinshilio. She suddenly stamped her feet, raised her fist, and hit him in the air with anger and laughter. Then she turned to look at him. Dragon King, you're such a bad guy. Li Yunxin was slightly stunned and blinked her eyes as well. His gaze was gentle and frivolous, and he said with a smile, So how am I bad? Xinshilio put the back of her fingers on her cheeks and looked at him from the corner of her eyes. It seemed that she was trying to cool down her slightly blushing face. I know that Dragon King likes to tease girls. By Yunxin, Red Lady, and the Enchantress beside you. But Dragon King, please don't tease me just because you're beautiful and Shilio admires your broad-mindedness and means. She exhaled softly. Because I know that if I really fall in love with a person like Dragon King, it won't end well. Li Yunxin laughed. You're such a smart girl. How could you fall for my trick? Besides, how do you know that I don't really feel close because I found a kindred spirit? Xinshilio pursed her lips and smiled again. A great hero like Dragon King won't care about kindred spirit or kindred spirit. Maybe it's just a spur-of-the-moment thing that I said to Shilio. Hearing her words, Li Yunxin's smile slowly disappeared. It turned into a kind of lost smile, looking a little disappointed. It seemed that he remembered an unforgettable experience that had been suppressed in his heart. He sighed with a smile and shook his head slightly. Alas. Fine. In the end, I am a demon now. People say that I'm cunning and heartless. But I used to be a human. After saying this, he looked up at Xianxilio. The little girl didn't seem to expect that her words could evoke Li Yunxin's melancholy. It seemed that she didn't expect that. He actually had such melancholy. She was stunned for a moment. After a while, a perturbed look appeared on her face, and she was about to speak. Li Yunxin immediately laughed again, as if he was suppressing the unhappiness in his heart. Fine, fine. Let's go to Yunshan immediately. So, the little girl felt a little guilty in her heart, but she couldn't express it, seeing Li Yunxin's forced smile. Soon, the guilt slowly fermented and became stronger. She gently bit her lips, glanced at Li Yunxin and said cautiously, "Then let's go with Dragon King." So, Li Yunxin smiled in his heart. Guilt, sympathy, or curiosity were always easy to lead to other emotions. This was a good start. Chapter 435. At night, Li Yunxin and Xianxilio go to Mount Yunshan. They talk a lot and think a lot. But someone else is going to the city of Wei. In fact, they are going to the former city of Wei. The fire that burned the city of Wei has just been extinguished for more than a month. With the huge and broken city as the center, the land within a radius of 10 miles is cracked. The vegetation has already withered. When the autumn wind blows, the sky is full of flying sand and choking smoke. There used to be a vast forest between the city of Wei and Dongting, but now the forest is gone. Before the fire in the city of Wei was extinguished, it ignited the vegetation in autumn. It burned from the city to the Dongting. Now the road is scorched black, as if it has been trampled and ravaged by an angry celestial being. Beside the Dongting Lake, there was a terrifying catastrophe. Mount Jun was blasted by thunder. One of the former magnificent scenery of Dongting no longer exists. Only half of a huge and ugly rock is standing on the water. But this is not the most frightening disaster. The real disaster is the water of Dongting Lake. In the past, Dongting with thousands of miles was vast and misty, like a fairyland. But now Dongting has almost become a dead place. When cultivators chased after Li Yunxin, they almost poisoned all the fish, shrimps and monsters in the entire lake. Although the venom in the water was removed later, the corpses were left in the lake. At first, the people living along the lake were overjoyed. They fished out the fresh fish and shrimps. They either ate them at home or sold them. But soon, anyone who touched those dead fish and shrimps had their skin ulcerated and vomited blood within 3 days. And those who ate these fish and shrimps bled from their 7 orifices, and their internal organs were all broken. In just 4 or 5 days, thousands of people died. For a moment, they all knew that it was the disaster caused by those fish and shrimps. They hurriedly poured the rest into the lake. As for those dead bodies, no one dared to touch them. A few were buried, and most of them were thrown into the lake. More than a month has passed. So many corpses are slowly rotting and fermenting in the lake. Soon all kinds of diseases have spread. Dongting becomes misty again. However, it was no longer water vapor, but a terrifying miasma. The only thing to be thankful for is that Dongting can only be entered but not exited. The surging Weishui River and several other small streams provide water for it. But it is not the source of a big river. As a result, the terrifying poisonous water and miasma only enveloped this vast area, and did not spread out like it did in all directions. Even so, the entire south of the Qing kingdom still suffered a terrifying blow. The area around Dongting had been a land of fish and rice since ancient times. It was one of the food-producing areas of the Qing kingdom. Now no one dared to divert water from Dongting for irrigation. More people living along the lake had left their homes. Half of the Qing kingdom was already in a state of panic. However, those who had left their homes were originally living a prosperous life, and could still get by. They had left their homeland for the sake of safety, but there were also some people who had no fixed abode, and could not afford food and clothing. They didn't own any land, and only made a living by working for others. At this time, for these people, it was another good thing. In order to cope with the current predicament, the state government issued an announcement. On the one hand, it was to appease people and persuade them to protect their homeland. On the other hand, it was said that anyone who went to the old city of Wei and the area around Dongting to reclaim the land, which was now ownerless land, would be allocated to them, and they would be exempted from taxes for 3 years. So many people came full of hope, and they saw the city of Wei and Dongting, which had been changed beyond recognition. In fact, in their eyes it was not bad. Weishui River was still clear, and there were fish and shrimps in the water. It was said that the government was also inviting cultivators to seal the water mouth between Weishui River and Dongting, so that the poisonous water would not overflow. Large tracts of land were covered with the ashes of burning forests. It not only saved the effort of reclaiming land, but also served as natural fertilizer. If they wanted to plant in winter and plow in spring, they only needed to dig out the roots of trees and grass in the wilderness. The workload was very small. Now it was mid-autumn. There was still time to plant some seedlings that could survive the winter before winter. With the grain provided by the government for half a year, there might be a bumper harvest next year. Such a prospect was an unimaginable happiness for many people. Therefore, there were more and more people around the city of Wei. Although there were not many people, they were gathering slowly. Tonight, 2 more people came treading through the night. They were 2 women. One was old and the other was young. In fact, the old woman was not old. She was only in her 30s, and could be regarded as a middle-aged woman. In the late autumn night, she was wrapped in a navy blue cotton cloak and a bamboo hat. Her attire was neither fish nor fowl. She looked like someone from the Jianghu, but she also looked like an ordinary woman. However, there were a few patches on her cloak. Maybe it was because she was poor that she used the bamboo hat to protect herself from the wind and sand. This middle-aged woman called herself Grandmother Bean. Behind Grandmother Bean was a young lady who looked about 16 or 17 years old. She was also wearing coarse clothes and a bamboo hat. But there were more patches on her clothes. But even so, if someone looked carefully through the disheveled hair hanging down from her face, they would discover that this young lady was a heavenly fragrance and national beauty. This young lady called herself Mother Ling, and said that she was Grandmother Bean's daughter. But outsiders would find it strange. This old woman did not care about her daughter. She carried a lot of things on her arms and back. She carried 2 huge halberds on her back, which were 7 feet long. 1/3 of them were on her back, and the other 2 long halberds were high up in the sky. Ordinary men would find it difficult to walk with such a back, but Mother Ling walked very steadily. She carried a bundle of swords under her left armpit, but they did not look like real weapons. They looked like toys made of thin iron sheets. Although it was bright and shiny, it would tremble from time to time. It reminded people of those street performers who played with swords and knives. His right hand was carrying a bulging blue bundle with white flowers on it. She carried bedding, clothes, and food. Even if this young lady had a slender figure, she looked bloated after carrying so many things on her back. That's right, he's a street performer. This was also their identity. At this moment, Grandmother Bean and Mother Ling, who looked like a coolie, were standing on a piece of scorched land. There were 6 or 7 tents behind them, which meant that 6 or 7 families lived here. They just arrived a few days ago. They built a shelter here and planned to slowly reclaim the land. They just asked a family. They said that if they walked for another 7 miles, they would reach the former city of Wei. They also advised them not to go further. The land near the city of Wei had been burned for dozens of days, and the land had already dried up. Nothing could grow within a radius of 10 miles. Even the grass seeds were baked into dust. It was better to live with these people and help each other. It's not a good idea to live with a mother and a daughter. You need a man. It's better to stay here and start a family. She kept persuading them like this for the whole night. But neither Grandmother Bean nor Mother Ling said anything. After saying goodbye to these reclaimers, the 2 continued to walk towards the direction of the city of Wei. After walking for about an hour, even the grass and wood ashes that had been mixed with the soil under their feet had disappeared, leaving only a thin layer of yellow sand. The air was getting drier and drier, and there was a gloomy coldness in the air. This coldness was not simply the coldness of the autumn night. It seemed to be because of something else. After another quarter of an hour, the silhouette of the city of Wei appeared on the horizon like a giant crawling beast. Grandmother Bean stopped walking, and the dry soil under her feet rustled. Then she turned around and looked to the west. To the west was the surging Wei River. Although they couldn't see the river from such a distance, they could hear the faint sound of the water. In the past, there were large tracts of farmland here. Walking along the path beside the farmland, they could see a small ferry crossing. But now it was all gone, leaving only the wilderness. Grandmother Bean stretched out a hand from under her cloak and pointed to the west. You said that the last time Li Yunxin met Long Jiu was at this ferry crossing? Mother Ling also stopped walking. She first took a breath, then looked to the west. She slightly narrowed her eyes. After a while she said softly, yes. Grandmother Bean took back her hand after getting this response. Anything else? Mother Ling was stunned. We only met and talked. Nothing else. Grandmother Bean tilted her head slightly and looked at her daughter with the corner of her eyes. But in her eyes, there was a coldness that didn't match her identity and appearance. Think again. Mother Ling shivered slightly and bit her lips. After thinking for a while, she said in a low voice, when he returned to the city that day, he met me on the road. That day, I followed him out of the city. Then, the two of us walked back along the road. That day someone died in the city, and on the road there was a stage. There was someone singing on the stage. As he thought, he talked slowly, and in small detail he talked a great deal. Grandmother Bean didn't rush her, but listened to her patiently for nearly half an hour. But in between, she would ask some detailed questions such as, did he frown at that time? Did he say definitely or definitely? Was his footsteps fast or slow? Mother Ling could answer some questions, but she couldn't remember some. When she finished talking and Grandmother Bean also finished asking, the middle-aged woman said, you have to remember. If you remember anything, any detail, you have to tell me. Whether it's useful or not is up to me, not you. If you are half as smart as you think, how could you be killed by Li Yunxin? After saying this, she walked away. Mother Ling didn't dare to say anything more. She just pursed her lips and followed. After half an hour, the two arrived at the gate of the city of Wei. This was the south gate of the city of Wei, called Yuaning Gate. Under the moonlight, they could see that the gate was still intact and hadn't collapsed. Looking inside, it was pitch black, as if there were countless evil spirits hiding inside. Grandmother Bean slowed down a little, and Mother Ling understood. She said in a low voice, that day, I entered the gate from here. When I came to the city of Wei, while talking they walked forward. Mother Ling described everything she saw that day in detail, as if she had reconstructed the scene at that time. Who would have thought that the once flourishing city of Wei would now be left with nothing but ruins? Not even rats and insects. In the darkness, there were only two people's footsteps and voices. It sounded very strange. He wandered around the city for many days, and gave away many paintings. He also carved some marks on the stone. Unknowingly, the two had walked along the dried-up Willow River for a mile, and came to a green stone. I also saw marks on this stone, but only half of them, and there was no Reiki flowing. The green stone that Mother Ling mentioned was next to the Willow River. Looking at it now, there were no marks. It seemed that a layer of the stone had been shaved off by a sword, and there were several cracks on it. It looked like it was smelted by fire. He gave the beggar a painting. Later, the beggar was killed in the alley. While listening to her, Grandmother Bean slowly attached herself to the stone. Her hands were still in the sleeves, and she squinted at the green stone for a while. Then she slowly stretched out her hand and drew half a symbol on the green stone. Like this? Mother Ling took a closer look. No. She thought for a while expressionlessly, and changed the pattern. Like this. But also not. Grandmother Bean was not in a hurry. If Mother Ling said no, she erased it. She used her palm to erase it from the surface of the stone, and then drew something else. Just like that, he tried for 4 hours. For 2 hours, she bent over and didn't move, and only her hand moved. He had tried more than 1,000 of those rune imprints. In the end, even Mother Ling was a little discouraged and said cautiously, Granny, maybe we should go to other places first? Grandmother Bean looked at her with a serious and cold gaze. Now you are a useless person. Do you know that if you want to regain your cultivation from us, You have to go through a lot of hardships? If you don't even have this kind of patience, humph. You can kill yourself now. Mother Ling was silent. Another hour passed. When Grandmother Bean wrote the 1646th rune on the stone, Mother Ling's eyes finally showed a light of relief. She looked carefully for a while, and took a deep breath. Yes. Grandmother Bean stood up, and stared at the rune for a while. She slowly frowned. What does it mean? She was talking to herself, and didn't ask for advice. Mother Ling didn't say anything. After thinking for half an hour, she walked away. The places they went, and the places they stopped at were all the places Li Yunxin had stopped at in the city of Wei a few days before she possessed Chiwen. So a whole night passed. When the sun rose again, Mother Ling had fallen asleep leaning against a broken wall. As for Grandmother Bean, she was standing on a tall stone pillar. This stone pillar used to be a part of the most prosperous restaurant in the city, Chonghua Restaurant. She squinted her eyes and looked down at the whole city with the morning light. Although most of the buildings had been burned down, the crisscrossing streets were still there. She watched from the moment the first rays of the sun appeared on the horizon until the first rays of the morning sun rose into the sky. Then she closed her eyes and thought silently for a while. She opened her eyes again and took out a booklet from her clothes. This booklet was the Prefecture Annals of the Wei River. In it were detailed records of the population and the size of the fields in the various towns and cities. The city of Wei used to be a big city, so the records were very detailed, to the point of which streets and alleys, which households, how many people, and how old they were. After reading for an hour, Grandmother Bean threw the annals away, and the booklet burned before it fell to the ground. Then she slowly raised her hand, and there was a magic pen in her hand. She began to draw something in the void with mysterious light. The background was the whole city of Wei in her sight. After a quarter of an hour she stopped. A human figure with all the meridians and acupoints appeared in front of her. The background was also the whole city of Wei. Chapter 436. Dragon King is a proud man. But if the fake sage's request makes Dragon King angry, don't be impulsive. In any case, just agree to it for the time being. We will slowly mediate. There will always be a chance. Xi and Shilio said to Li Yunxin while they were walking in a grotto. 6 hours ago, the two of them took the star shuttle carried by Xi and Shilio, and arrived at Cloud Mountain in the blink of an eye. Li Yunxin had originally wanted to take a closer look at Yun Shan's appearance, but the star shuttle didn't allow him to do so. When the magical treasure flew, there was a layer of frost on the outside, completely blocking the scenery outside, so he couldn't see anything. Perhaps this was the arrangement of the Freemasonry. They didn't want Li Yunxin to know too many secrets for the time being. It reminded him of the world in which he had come from, where terrorist groups blindfolded people when they took them to their lair. When the magic treasure was put away again, Li Yunxin and Xi and Shilio were in this grotto. According to Xi and Shilio, this grotto was in the hinterland of Cloud Mountain. It was 3 or 4 miles away from the outermost layer of Cloud Mountain. The star shuttle they were on also flew directly into the black hole from another long passage. Although it was a grotto, it looked more like it was artificially excavated. The ground was flat, and the stone walls on both sides were also flat. The top was domed, and the cross-section was like a piece of bread. It was very long. At this time, the two of them had been walking for a quarter of an hour, but they still hadn't reached the end. Xi and Shilio began to look worried, which was in sharp contrast to her calmness in front of Ku Chanzi. It seemed that the closer she got to the two sages, the more nervous and frightened she became. She told Li Yunxin a lot of things, as if she was afraid that he would really anger the two sages and get out of Cloud Mountain. After walking for another quarter of an hour, she stopped and said, "Dragon King, this is as far as I can go. Further ahead is the forbidden area of Cloud Mountain. Without the summons of the fake sage, I can't enter." The light in this grotto was dim. However, there seemed to be mushrooms refined with spiritual power on the walls, which emitted a faint fluorescence. This made Xi and Shilio's face clearer. She bit her lips. "Once something happens, does the Dragon King need me to do anything?" Li Yunxin was silent along the way. At this time he also stopped. He looked at Xi and Shilio, and thought for a moment. Then he smiled and shook his head. Don't worry. I'm here to tell them something, not to die. Even so, Xi and Shilio was still not at ease. Li Yunxin was silent for a while and said, I have a way out. Go ahead. After saying this, he suddenly reached out and rubbed Xi and Shilio's head. The little girl did not have a Taoist name, nor did she wear a Taoist robe. Her hair was not tied up in a Taoist bun, but a bun that was close to the clouds. Thus, when Li Yunxin gently rubbed and retracted his hand, she realized what he had done. For a moment, she was a little stunned, but being stunned and shy was not her character. She laughed again, and pretended to be annoyed. Li Yunxin laughed and walked forward. The smile on Xi and Shilio's face gradually faded. When Li Yunxin's figure gradually disappeared, she raised her head and gently touched her bun. He used a little force, so it was not messed up. Then, she put her hand down, and sighed with mixed feelings. A way out. Li Yunxin disappeared after taking another 6 steps forward. In fact, there was still a long way to go before he and Xi and Shilio parted ways. The end was hidden in the darkness, and could not be seen clearly. He thought he would have to walk for another 15 minutes. Actually, after taking 6 steps forward, he suddenly saw a bright light. It was as if with a single step, he had stepped into the warm spring from the dark and gloomy cave. Suddenly, a vast world opened up in front of him. The blue sky and white clouds rushed toward him. There was also a warm wind, the fragrance of flowers and trees, and the distant chirping of birds. Now he was on a cliff. There were cliffs all around him. Dense vegetation grew on the cliff, covering the rock wall tightly. He frowned slightly and turned around. He found that the road he came from had disappeared. There was a stone wall behind him. He tried to push it with his hand. The stone wall was very hard. It was not an illusion. So he turned around and looked ahead. He saw a small cloud mountain. An upside-down mountain was floating in the air. There were pavilions and terraces on the small mountain. It was covered with verdant vegetation and gorgeous flowers. It was like a fairyland. In this wider space there were mountains, rivers, blue sky, and white clouds. It was like a complete small world. This was the residence of the 2 sages that Xi and Shilio told him. According to what she had said, the 2 saints should be on that small mountain floating in the sky. Li Yunxin thought for a while, and decided to go up the mountain. This place did not have the imposing manner of facing a great enemy, nor were there any enemies eyeing them covetously. They looked elegant and kind. But this kind of enemy was much more difficult to deal with than those guys who were bearing their fangs and claws. However, just as he took a step forward, and was about to fly away, he suddenly heard a voice. Wei River Dragon King is the royal family of the water. Do you know the Ruoshui River? The person who spoke was very close to him, but he did not notice it. He immediately stopped and raised his hand to look ahead. He saw an old man with white hair and beard standing in the air. No, he was not standing in the air. He was stepping on a bird the size of half a palm. Usually, only the 2 sages lived on the small cloud mountain. This old man should be the so-called sage of calligrapher. If he saw a real sage, it referred to the kind of sage whose body and soul had merged into one, and both were in their peak state. He might feel a little nervous and awestruck. This emotion was because the other party had a power that was beyond the knowledge of the world. However, none of the so-called sages he had met were in such a state. Among them, some only had memories, some had incarnations, and some were like the one in front of him. Only the physical body was real, but the inside was a Freemasonry wandering soul. They could be counted as high-level wandering souls. So he only paused for a moment and then smiled. His tone was gentle and calm, without any fear. Isn't the Ruoshui River surrounding the 10 Directions world? Of course I have heard of it. Your Excellency, how should I address you? The old man also smiled. This is the small cloud mountain, the residence of the 2 sages. Wei River Dragon King. Don't you know who I am? Li Yunxin was still smiling, but he squinted his eyes. It is because I know who you are that I have to ask. The current sage of calligrapher's real name is Su Yusong. Are you the real one? His words were not friendly. However, the old man was not angry, and his temper was not provoked. After a moment of silence, he let out a sigh. So it is about this matter. Alas! He reached out his hand and pointed at Li Yunxin. Wei River Dragon King's body is not Li Yunxin's body. Do you still think you are someone else? Besides, I have been Su Yusong for 1,000 years. After such a long time, I don't care who I was before and who I am now. After all, it is just a name. Just like Wei River Dragon King, Wei River Lord Li Yunxin, aren't they all you? Li Yunxin nodded. That makes sense. Then I will call you Su Weng. Su Weng suddenly asked Ruo Water, what does that mean? Su Yusong raised his hand and pointed around. Wei River Lord, you know about Ruo Water. You should know that Ruo Water can't carry anything, not even a feather. In this small cloud mountain it is like Ruo Water. If you stepped out just now, you would have fallen straight down like a mortal. Li Yunxin was slightly surprised. He had heard about the story of Ruo Water. It was said that this land was the midland of the 10 Directions world, which was extremely vast. Surrounding the midland were many oceans. Beyond the oceans there was Ruo Water. There was no obvious boundary between Ruo Water and the ocean. However, Ruo Water couldn't carry anything, and no one could cross it. If someone sailed in the ocean and crossed the boundary between the ocean and Ruo Water, he would immediately sink, never to float again. Both the person and the boat would soon be crushed into flat pancakes, and there would be no chance of survival. If it wasn't a human being, but a cultivator or a spirit creature, what would happen if he left the shore and flew into the vast Ruo Water? Unbelievably, no one ever found out, because the Taoist gate didn't allow this. Of course, the Taoist gate didn't have its own consciousness. This consciousness probably came from the divine beings. It was said that deep in the Ruo Water, there was a palace of the divine beings in the human world. The divine beings didn't want their pure land to be spied on by ordinary people. Therefore, they ordered Daotong to set up sentry posts in the ocean surrounding the midland, and forbade cultivators to go deep into the Ruo Water. However, there would always be people who disobeyed the rules. Throughout the tens of thousands of years, how could there not be rebellious cultivators and spirit creatures who wanted to try? No one ever succeeded. Leaving the ocean and flying on the surface of the Ruo Water, no matter how high they flew, they would be affected by the Ruo Water. Their spirit power would be drained quickly. Even the most powerful cultivators and spirit creatures could only fly for hundreds of miles. Of course, this referred to those who flew out and then flew back. Some of them didn't even think about going back, and used the last bit of their power to move forward. So they never came back. Li Yunxin had only heard about this from his parents. However, back then, he wasn't very powerful, and he didn't see many powerful spirit creatures and high-level cultivators. Therefore, he only felt that this was just one of the all kinds of magical things in this world. Was there anything more surprising than the fact that spirit creatures and spirit creatures really existed in this world? But now, he had experienced a lot, and his cultivation had gradually improved. Therefore, he understood more principles and rules. He also knew that, even in this world, not everything was magical without rules. Spirit creatures and spirit creatures, their spirit power system, or spirit creature power system, all followed another set of principles. People had cultivated for tens of thousands of years, and this set of principles had slowly been perfected and could be applied to almost every field of cultivation. For example, creating a new kind of magic, you didn't even have to try it yourself. As long as you simulated how to do it in your mind, and how to guide spirit power, you could deduce the possible results according to the orthodox cultivation system. Therefore, for some other things, you could also judge whether it was possible or impossible according to the common sense of cultivation. But the problem was that the Ruo Water, according to what he knew now, it was obviously impossible. The legendary Ruo Water sounded like some kind of terrible restriction. This kind of restriction brutally prohibited all spirit power, spirit creature power, and even all kinds of rules and powers that were common in the secular world. Something of this level, even the two sages couldn't make it. This was not referring to lack of ability, but contrary to the entire cultivation system. But now, in this Shaoran mountain, Su Yusong told him that there was such a thing. One of the things that Li Yunxin was most interested in since he came to this world was cultivation. Now that he encountered this most interesting thing that puzzled him the most, he immediately became extremely curious. Seeing his slightly surprised expression, Su Yusong stood on the bird and smiled. But there is a way. For example, with the power of this bird, you can also come and go freely. Dragon King may not be very good at this. I can explain it to Dragon King. At this point, he suddenly found that Li Yunxin's eyes lit up. Su Yusong had been the art sage for as long as 1,000 years. Since he had almost forgotten his previous identity, naturally he couldn't remember the time when his original body as a wandering soul was still a child. Therefore, for a moment, he didn't understand what the sudden burst of light in Li Yunxin's eyes meant. The next moment, Li Yunxin suddenly leaped forward a big step. Su Yusong hurriedly said, "I have already said here." So Li Yunxin's step really missed, and his whole body fell straight down. He was 2 miles away from the ground, a height of 1,000 meters. Looking down from here, the river was just a blue ribbon, and the vast forest was also like moss. However, when Li Yunxin fell, he put his hands behind his back, as if he was playing. The process of falling only lasted for a dozen blinks of an eye, only to hear a bang. Suddenly a small yellow, shallow pit appeared on the green ground. This was naturally from Su Yusong's point of view. Li Yunxin fell into the forest. She didn't even bend her knees. However, he was a powerful god and demon, so he was naturally unharmed. But a small patch of trees where his feet landed was knocked over by him, and more trees around him were swept down. He looked up at the sky again, frowned slightly, and sighed lightly. It was not mainly because he wanted to jump for fun, but he wanted to try this space that was no different from the weak water. As the art sage said, the result was a little disappointment and a little surprise. The disappointment was that there was no special experience, such as the flow of spiritual power was not smooth, the snow mountain and ocean of chi was sealed, or the body was restrained. Everything was still the same, and his body was not affected at all. It was also because of this. Everything was normal, but the supernatural power did not work. The demonic power could flow along the meridians, but it did not work. It was like people knew that water could put out a fire. Now a pile of wood was on fire, but it could not be extinguished with cold water. This was indeed a strange restraint that could not be explained by the cultivation theory that he knew. After 2 breaths, Su Yusong also rushed down. He was still standing in the air, looking at Li Yunxin strangely. Is Dragon King playing around? Li Yunxin looked up and smiled, looking at him. It's just. At this point he suddenly paused. The expression on his face gradually changed, and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. He stared at Su Yusong, and a slightly scary thought suddenly flashed in his mind. Chapter 437. Su Yusong also frowned because of his performance. What does Dragon King want to say? Li Yunxin looked at his face. He was hesitating. This was a very rare thing for him. He always did things according to his heart, and made decisions decisively. Usually, if he hesitated for more than 10 breaths, he would be considered indecisive. However, Su Yusong, who was staring at the air, thought again and again, then suddenly lowered his voice and said, "Could it be that the 2 of you are imprisoned?" Su Yusong's expression suddenly changed. Previously, he was smiling faintly, which was really the demeanor of a master. But now, the expression on his face froze for a moment, and then changed into a mysterious smile. In fact, it seemed that it was just making the muscles on his face twitch, making an expression similar to a smile. Then, he stood on the flying bird and lowered his head. He stared at Li Yunxin with a pair of frighteningly bright eyes. "Dragon King, why do you say that?" Li Yunxin thought for a moment. "Because I suddenly thought of something. After I arrived in Weiqing, everyone was thinking about my translucent jade slip. But they were all a group of small fries, and they even called themselves the 2 holy emissaries," he said slowly, thinking as he spoke. He felt that many questions that he didn't understand at that time were now slowly being solved. The Freemasons also came, and they also wanted the translucent jade slip. At that time, I didn't know the relationship between the Freemasons and Xianmen, so I didn't feel strange. But later, I slowly understood and began to feel that something was wrong. Since Xianmen is almost under the control of the Freemasons, why did the Freemasons and Xianmen not seem to be on the same side? And they don't seem to know each other. Since the saints want to do something, why do they have to be sneaky and only send cannon fodder? Is such a petty act really the work of a saint? After that, when other people came and wanted to join forces to kill me, they almost didn't mention the translucent jade slip. Or they only wanted to kill me because I killed the Freemasons and offended their dignity. They wanted revenge. Either that or the Daotong Kenzo are here to seek revenge for the deaths of their fellow disciples. It's a mess. Li Yunxin shook his head in confusion and paced a few steps on the spot. The fallen branches and leaves under his feet rustled as he stepped on them, and a burst of fragrance rose up. And most importantly, he breathes a sigh of relief and looks up at Su Yusong. When we were near Dongting, Kuan Wuzi could overturn Dongting with just one incarnation, and he was just in the mysterious realm of the first level. Above that, there was the profoundness of life realm, and above that was the supreme oblivion realm. On the other hand, the two sages have been in this realm for 1,000 years. If they really wanted to obtain the translucent jade slip, wouldn't it have been a piece of cake? He was silent for a while. But you never showed up in person. He has never displayed any divine abilities. The corner of Su Yusong's mouth twitched. The bird under his feet also lowered slightly. He leaned over and jumped down from the bird, landing in front of Li Yunxin. Then go on. His tone was a little lighter. It seemed that he didn't want to disturb Li Yunxin's thinking, so that he couldn't hear more wonderful deductions. His behavior, expression, and tone actually didn't match his appearance with white hair and beard. It looked like the soul of a young man had been stored in an old body. But here, you actually have to step on the bird. Li Yunxin raised his hand and pointed to the sky. This means that in this space, you also lost a lot of divine abilities, and you can't even dance in the air. Since Mount Shaoyan is the residence of the two sages, why did they make this kind of inhibition that even they couldn't break? Su Yusong let out a soft ah. But you also lost your divine abilities. Li Yunxin smiled. Yes. But because it was me. Only in terms of physical strength. What if it was the Shinryu? Wouldn't you be courting death? So I was thinking, you didn't want the Freemasonry to know that you were looking for the translucent jade slip. Now you found a Taoist Danqing to send me here directly. You haven't left this place, and there is a prohibition here. Are you guys imprisoned? Are you imprisoned by the Freemasonry? Su Yusong didn't answer his question. Instead, he was silent for a while, and looked at Li Yunxin strangely. I heard before that you are smart and arrogant. Now that I see it, it's a little interesting. After saying this, he raised his head and looked at the place where Li Yunxin came from. From the time you came here until now, it has only been a quarter of an hour. You suspect that I am imprisoned? Others can't say this. Li Yunxin frowned and smiled. This expression seemed to indicate that he was a little impatient. Impatient with Su Yusong's roundabout way of speaking. But he still gave some patience. You said that I am impatient. Yes, I am impatient. I should get along with you for a few more days, talk to you a few more times, and observe the situation of your Mount Shaoyan. Then we can probe each other, and when there are more details, I will say what I think. It should be like this. Li Yunxin shook his head. But in fact, most people's opinions on a matter can be formed in a very short period of time. It's just that they don't dare to think about it, and don't dare to say it. So what if they say it? If it's right, we can be honest. If it's wrong, we can give up on a wrong path. We won't go further. What's more, I don't have too much time. He slightly emphasized. In fact, there are still 10 days. Zither King planted a ball of demonic power in my body. He said that if I don't appear in front of him after 10 days, I will die. So, I hope that we can be frank, such as why you want to see me and not kill me. And what do I want to do here? Don't do those fake things. You should know what happens to those who want to do these things with me. The last few words were said in an overbearing manner, as if he wasn't facing a sage, but someone of the same realm as him. Su Yusong didn't say anything. After looking at him for a while, he suddenly stretched out his hand. Li Yunxin had heard before that this move of his looks extremely slow, but it feels unavoidable. But he always thought it was nonsense. But now, he actually experienced this feeling. Su Yusong stretched out his hand, about to touch his forehead. He frowned slightly and stepped back. But just as this thought came to him, the finger had already touched his forehead. He was shocked. The finger touched and then withdrew. Then Su Yusong stroked his snow-white beard. There is indeed a ball of demonic power. And I can't get rid of it for a while. Zither King, this is a clever move. Not only to verify the truth of his words, but also to respond to his disrespect, just now. Then, he looked at Li Yunxin seriously. It's a good thing that you are so impatient. After so many years of training, I'm used to the slow movements of those Taoist priests and swordsmen. But seeing you as an exception. As for your question about whether I'm imprisoned, Su Yusong smiled. Are you referring to my body or the wandering souls in my body? By saying this, he almost admitted Li Yunxin's inference. That was unexpected. For such a long time, anyone from the Freemasonry or the celestial sect he had met didn't seem to like to talk nicely. Their temperaments were extreme and eccentric, and it was extremely difficult to communicate with them. He thought this fake sage would be even more difficult to talk to. But he didn't expect it to be like this. Li Yunxin was a little stunned. While he was stunned, Su Yusong stepped forward and walked into the dense forest. I planned to tell you when we reached the mountain. But I didn't expect you to be an impatient person like me. Dragon King, let's talk as we walk. When he said this, even the faint smile on his face disappeared. His face became solemn, as if he had accepted Li Yunxin as his ally in his heart, and planned to talk to him about something very important. Li Yunxin always did things unexpectedly, but he didn't expect to be defeated by Su Yusong as soon as he entered Cloud Mountain. He frowned suspiciously. He stared at Su Yusong for a long time before he raised his feet to follow. There were strange things every year. But this year, there were especially many. The vegetation in this forest was verdant, and the giant trees towered into the sky. The grass on the ground was like a carpet, and the flowers were gorgeous. No one knew how many years they had experienced. The light shining from the treetops was no different from the sunlight outside. He didn't know if some kind of magical power had been cast on the top of the sky. When Li Yunxin caught up with him and walked side by side with him, Su Yusong continued, that Taoist artifact and 4 magic treasures, are you happy with them? Li Yunxin was taken aback by his words. But this surprise was like the wind that swept through his heart. His face didn't change, and he said lightly, I just refined them. I can't use them as I wish. Su Yusong smiled. Those 4 magic treasures are our greeting gifts to Dragon King. You, me, and the sword saint that Dragon King spoke of. Ha! Li Yunxin snorted softly. The way you two give gifts is very unique. As they spoke, they had already entered the forest. This forest was very lush, and the sun couldn't be seen, as if it was dusk. In such an environment, Su Yusong seemed to be much more at ease. Thus he turned his head and looked at Li Yunxin. Gold photon. Sigh. I know that she has offended Dragon King very badly. So this time I gave her the magic treasures, and told her to welcome you. She went to welcome you. If she wanted to shake hands with you and reconcile, then that Taoist artifact could save her life. Gold photon is actually a very capable and courageous person. If she wanted to kill you, then that would be exactly what you wanted. If she died, the 4 magic treasures would fall into your hands. Consider them our greeting gifts to you. The magic treasures and her. Li Yunxin was silent for a while, using your own kind as a chess piece, and giving it away just like that. I don't know if I should say that my reputation is big, or your methods are ruthless. What if she killed me? Then you're not worth our effort anymore. Su Yusong laughed, his beard and hair fluttering in the wind. Dragon King's cultivation is not top-notch. What we value is your ability and mind to bring chaos to the world. If you can't even deal with a mere gold photon, what use are you to us? Then, what use do I have to you now? Su Yusong stopped and looked at him. Didn't you come to Cloud Mountain to tell us about the demon's arrangements and plans? Chapter 438. Li Yunxin also stopped. He tilted his head and laughed. All right. Since you know everything, what's the use of me? We want to hear the truth from you. Su Yusong looked at him seriously. I know what you're thinking now. Demons, Freemasonry, Celestial Sect, you don't like any of them. So you plan to wander on both sides and inform each other, so that the strategies between us will be useless, and we can only fight each other with brute force until both sides are injured and fall apart. In this way, the world may be in chaos for others, but for you, it's like a peaceful sea and clear river. You've gotten a chance to breathe. But we don't want you to do that. Li Yunxin stopped laughing and became expressionless. Oh, you see, I can see it clearly. So you want to win? The word "we" you said has two meanings to me, Su Yusong said. One refers to the Freemasonry. The other refers to the two saints. I guess you're taking the first meaning. But in reality, we're different. He saw that Li Yunxin was not moved, so he slightly emphasized. At least, we wandering souls are different from the elders. What the elders want is not to win. The result that the elders want is the same as the result that you want. These words finally moved Li Yunxin. In fact, he had been hiding the emotions in his heart since he entered Mount Shaoyan. Entering Mount Shaoyan meant that he would come into contact with the middle and upper echelons of the Freemasonry. This also meant that he might be able to obtain more secrets about this mysterious organization, about the 414 elders. Now that Su Yusong, who was possessed by a wandering soul, had bluntly mentioned the result that the elders wanted, he realized that he might be about to know something important. So he let out a sigh. Have you seen those elders? I haven't, Su Yusong said seriously. Although I'm a wandering soul that possesses a saint, I still can't face them directly. However, their ideas are carried out by us. Li Yunxin. The elders also hope that the Celestial Sect and the demons will both suffer. If their goal is achieved, not only will you not get any breathing space, you will also be taken care of by the elders. Your days might be even more miserable than now. Li Yunxin's face showed just the right amount of confusion and curiosity. Why do they want to do this? Are Daotong and Kinzo already under your control? Why did you destroy it? We can't guess what the elders are thinking. Su Yusong smiled faintly. But we can speculate. He paused for a moment and observed the changes in Li Yunxin's expression before continuing. I know you're curious about what exactly the Freemasons are trying to do. Let me tell you first, we are not heinous criminals. On the contrary, we want to save the world. So, you believe that there will be a great calamity in the future, and you plan to lead the world to resist this calamity. Li Yunxin smiled. Every organization that claims to save the world has such a slogan. Not at all. The calamity we are talking about has already begun, from 50,000 years ago. Su Yusong didn't care about his mockery. He said the following words in a steady tone, his expression solemn and sincere, without the slightest trace of excitement or insanity. This calamity is the celestial beings and their agents in the world, Daotong and Kinzo. They are the calamity of all mortals in the world, the calamity of all mortals. Su Yusong said this slowly, then looked at Li Yunxin again. In your eyes, what kind of existence is the celestial gate? Li Yunxin frowned and said casually, shepherd tens of thousands of people? Make the world less troubled by war? My thoughts are meaningless. Since you said it's the calamity of mortals, it has nothing to do with me. Tell me about it. Alas, Su Yusong sighed softly, as if slightly disappointed by the fact that he was still wary. Fine. Listen carefully. At the beginning of the creation of the world, there were humans on this sphere, and the celestial beings passed down the method of cultivation. Some people cultivated the method and became cultivators, possessing great magical powers. Then, these people helped the mortals to repel the beasts and open up their homes, and the cities and countries of the mortals slowly flourished. This is a good point. But then, Daotong and Kinzo appeared. They began to shepherd tens of thousands of people on behalf of the celestial beings, and divided many countries. These countries were not allowed to attack each other, and were told to live and work in peace, and recuperate. In this way, it has been a whole 50,000 years. 50,000 years. Su Yusong sighed again. I have been the sage of calligraphy for 1,000 years. Therefore, I have read many historical books left in the celestial gate. I can clearly see the appearance of 5 years ago to 48,000 years ago. When humans first appeared in the world, they were ignorant and didn't know etiquette. Later, they gradually learned how to make fire, hunt, and tailor clothes. Then they learned how to build cities and forge weapons. Gradually, they learned how to write and write, and how to play the wind and string instruments. From beast-like things to today's elegant appearance, it only took 2,000 years. Then, he looked at Li Yunxin. From 45,000 years ago to today, it has been a whole 45,000 years. There are no more changes. The swords and sabers used today are the same as 45,000 years ago. The clothes today are still the same as then. Why is this so? He frowned suddenly. It is because of the existence of Daotong and Kenzo. The world knows that there are immortals and immortal Taoism. Thus, he regarded these things as the standard, and thought that all other magical arts were unorthodox. And the Celestial Gate also has the same attitude, and the government follows suit. Anyone who tries other methods will be reprimanded lightly and beaten severely. You were born at a good time. But do you know what the world was like 1,000 years ago? Anyone who did not abide by the ancestral rules set by Sendo would be tied up and paraded in the streets. If it wasn't for the Freemasonry secretly doing many things, how could it be like this now? Because of this, people stopped moving forward and no longer had the heart to forge ahead. Countless people's intelligence and wisdom were buried because of the existence of Daotong and Kenzo. And this Daotong and Kenzo? They were isolated from the world, high and aloof, strictly adhering to the Taoism passed down by the celestial man. These immortal techniques, are they benefiting the common people now? They are only benefiting this very, very small number of people. Therefore, Celestial Man and Celestial Gate, after the first 2,000 years, from 48,000 years ago to the present, have become the world's greatest calamity. Li Yunxin listened to all of this in silence. There was no surprise on his face. Because of this problem, he had considered it. In his previous world, from the beginning of human civilization to his time, when humans had the ability to completely destroy most of the creatures on that planet, it was only 10,000 years. And in that 10,000 years, the time of war and killing occupied 80 to 90% of the time. Only a very short period was the golden period of civilization development. And this world had been in peace and prosperity for 50,000 years. The level of civilization was still low. He also thought that perhaps this was because of the existence of celestial man. People knew that there was such a group of celestial man, so they would put more energy into cultivating to become celestial man, and not other things. But Su Yusong's words, he smiled. If that's the case, I remember when I was in the city of Wei, I gave someone the prescription of the black medicine. He was immediately killed by your people. How do you explain this matter? Su Yusong said seriously. I know this matter. But that was the decision of the elders. I can't understand it. But because of this we noticed you. So the elders wanted to destroy Celestial Gate. At the same time of destroying Celestial Gate, they also destroyed the demons. When there are no more cultivators and monsters in the world, it will be a paradise for mortals. At that time, people's intelligence and wisdom will be displayed, and people will be more prosperous. Li Yunxin frowned. This sounds like a good thing. Even I am tempted. Do you have any other opinions? Su Yusong looked at him with bright eyes. You forget that there are still celestial men. Celestial men have not issued a decree for nearly 1,000 years. So the elders think that celestial men are gone. Therefore, they plan to completely eliminate the demons of Celestial Gate, once and for all. But from our point of view, what if celestial men reappear in the world? What if they find that their agent in the world has been overthrown, and they are furious and send disaster? Moreover, now that we have almost controlled Celestial Gate, if we patiently infiltrate it for another 1,000 years, Daotong and Kenzo will completely become our puppets. At that time, through Celestial Gate to change the world, wouldn't it be much safer? Not only will we have an explanation for the world, but we will also not anger celestial men. Li Yunxin silently paced 2 steps on the spot. Then he turned to look at him. You are not telling the truth. Su Yusong was slightly stunned. The elders will not be so stupid, Li Yunxin said calmly. Because celestial men have not issued a decree for 1,000 years, they think that they will not appear again, so they want to completely overturn Celestial Gate. This kind of stupid thing, no one with a brain can do. There must be an inside story. You are not telling the truth. Su Yusong stared at him for a while, shook his head and smiled. In the end, you are Li Yunxin. You know so many things that are unimaginable to others, but you still ask such a question. Then, he paused for a moment. What I've just said to you is something that I can decide to tell you. But what you want to know now is something that I cannot make the decision myself. To answer this question of yours, I have to involve celestial men, and even Sun Luo Temple. I need to get more people's approval. He hesitated for a while, thinking for a while, as if he had made a decision and sighed, all right. You come with me. After saying that, he lifted his feet and walked deeper into the forest. Li Yunxin followed. His heartbeat quickened slightly. He felt that he seemed to be getting closer to the truth. Chapter 439. This time, the two of them walked for almost an hour. Apart from some really casual chatting, they didn't say anything else. But even so, Li Yunxin gradually felt a little strange. The strange feeling came from Su Yusong. Su Yusong looked like an old man. Purely in terms of physical body, this body should be nearly 3,000 years old. But now, inside the leather bag was not the original goods, but a Freemasonry wandering soul. But even so, this wandering soul had already possessed this body 1,000 years ago. A person who had lived for more than 1,000 years. Li Yunxin had come into contact with Taoist priests who were hundreds of years old. But those cultivators spent most of their time on Cloud Mountain, which was very different from those who were hundreds of years old in the secular world. For example, a lonely child who was wandering outside from a young age would know a lot about the ways of the world at the age of 11 or 12, while a child who was pampered from a young age might still be childish and willful at the age of 18 or 19. As if he had not grown up. These people who were dedicated to cultivation might meditate for a few days, or even more than 10 days. In terms of relative time, their 100, 200, or 300 years was actually not far from the decades of mortals. Even in terms of petty cleverness, mortals were slightly better than them. But the problem was, inside Su Yusong's body were wandering souls. These wandering souls would not abandon any desires. They would also change between different bodies, and their experience was far more than that of mortals. What was a guy who had lived for 1,000 years in such a state like? Li Yunxin found it hard to imagine, because even for himself, he had lived for many years in his previous life, and then came to this world with the memories of his previous life. He could be considered to have lived longer than ordinary people, and seen more than ordinary people. Even at his level, he was considered an amazing monster in this world. Not to mention those who had lived for 1,000 years. Their emotions and thoughts were not something that ordinary people could guess, right? Even he could not. But this was the problem. Li Yunxin was extremely vigilant, trying to find out his thinking pattern in the process of chatting with him, to see what kind of surprising state of consciousness that had lived for 1,000 years was. However, he did not notice anything unusual. Su Yusong seemed to be a smart person. His speech was logical, and his temperament was not as extreme as the wandering souls he had encountered before. But that was all, a wiser older man. This shouldn't be what a consciousness that had existed for 1,000 years should look like. With such doubts in his mind, he walked for another quarter of an hour, before his vision suddenly darkened. The forest was originally covered with giant trees, so it was already very dark. But now, it was dark again because several giant trees were slightly tilted in front of them. The dense canopies of the trees merged together, forming a natural hall. There were no trees below, only neatly trimmed grass. On the grass there were some seats and couches. There was a small table on the bed, and there were fresh fruits and cups on the small table. It looked like a rich family in the secular world going on an outing. Right now, there were already 8 people standing there. Li Yunxin was slightly taken aback. Su Yusong slowed down. Dragon King, don't worry. They know what we're about to say. Then, as he walked forward, he raised his voice and said to those people, "This is Wei River Dragon King Li Yunxin." Among the 8 people, there were 7 men and 1 woman. The woman had an extraordinary bearing and was dressed luxuriously. When he saw them, they were in the middle of a heated discussion. But even so, the 7 men were very respectful to the woman, as if they were stars surrounding the moon. The remaining 7 people also had extraordinary bearing and were dressed in colorful magical robes. Whether it was the expression on their faces or their postures, Li Yunxin could not help but think of Kuan Wuzi. In fact, he had guessed correctly. After introducing Li Yunxin to them, Su Yusong turned to look at him. These are the leaders of the 7 paradises. But he did not introduce the woman. So Li Yunxin knew that this woman should be the sword saint of the 2 sages, whose secular name was Zhuomuja. He did not like to interact with many people. It was not because he was afraid of socializing, but because it made him feel uneasy. For example, right now, including Su Yusong, there were 9 people in total, and none of them were small characters who could be treated as background characters. Right now it was hard to say whether they were friends or foes. He had to figure out their thoughts and see through the changes in the situation. But with so many people, he had to divide his attention. He could not control the situation. This was not a good feeling. So he stopped. Is it the real leader or? It's our brother. Su Yusong had already walked to their side and turned to look at Li Yunxin. The elders have a council of elders. The 9 of us are also the council of elders for us wandering souls. Many things up until now were the results of our joint discussions. If the Dragon King wants to know more inside information, he must see them. So they were also wandering souls who had been possessed. Before Li Yunxin could speak, the 7 leaders had already reported their identities. But they did not report their identities in Daotong or Kenzo, but their identities as wandering souls of the Freemasonry. Their tone was gentle, and their expressions were indifferent. But it was an unmistakable, supercilious, polite distance. Li Yunxin had seen this kind of expression many times, so he did not take it seriously now. Therefore, he cupped his hands and returned the greeting like a secular person. It was rare for him to look calm as he was now. Then, Su Yusong went straight to the point. The Dragon King wants to know some things about the elders. On the way here, I said that one person can't make the decision alone, and that everyone needs to discuss it together. What do you think? The leaders of the 7 grotto heavens looked at each other. After a moment of silence, someone frowned. So, senior brother has already told him about the other things? Su Yusong nodded. Yes. So they looked at Li Yunxin again, with a little surprise in their eyes. It seemed that they did not expect him to still be able to stand here calmly after knowing that. But finally someone sighed. Since senior brother has already made the decision, we have nothing to say. Let's listen to senior brother and senior sister. Su Yusong looked at Sword Saint Zhuomuja. The female Sword Saint glanced at Li Yunxin indifferently, nodded, and also lowered her eyes. This meant that she agreed. Li Yunxin saw the reactions of these people. So he knew that there were only 2 people in charge of the so-called Elder Council composed of 9 people. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja. But between the 2 of them, Su Yusong was the dominant one. This was normal. Someone had to be the leader. So Su Yusong walked to a couch and knelt down, waving to Li Yunxin. Then Dragon King, listen to me. At this time, the behavior of the rest of the people slightly surprised Li Yunxin. This trip to Cloud Mountain was a matter of life and death for him. He had devoted almost all of his energy to this major event. So he subconsciously thought that it was also a big matter for the 2 sages on Cloud Mountain. But now, Su Yusong walked to the side and sat down, and the 8 people gathered again, and walked to the other side of the hall made of giant wood. They were discussing something around Sword Saint Zhuomuja. Obviously, they were discussing something else. It seemed that Li Yunxin's arrival was just an interlude for them. For example, when they were discussing many things, one of them suddenly brought a guest. So they greeted the guest politely and estranged, and continued what they were doing. This meant that Cloud Mountain, which was a matter of life and death for Li Yunxin, was just one of many things for them. It was not even particularly important. He frowned slightly, exhaled softly, took a few more steps, and sat down in front of Su Yusong. The white-haired old man seemed to have seen through his thoughts. So he looked at Li Yunxin with a smile. Did Dragon King just think of this? Then he raised his hand and pointed around. There are many heavenly caves and sects on this Cloud Mountain, and many cultivators and mortals. Below Cloud Mountain, there is the entire secular dynasty and billions of people. There is also the upcoming war with demons. There are many things that we have to think about. Of course, the Dragon King was different. But there are more things that are even more different. He said it implicitly, but Li Yunxin understood. He understood and his heart skipped a beat. He realized that he seemed to have forgotten himself before. It seemed it started when his state of mind was broken on Mount June. He made a mistake. And he knew this mistake a long time ago. Everyone in this world thinks they are the main characters. And they measure the whole world with themselves as the center. But the truth is, when you think everyone on the road is paying attention to you, you are just one of the many strangers, one of the vast background on the road. What you think is very important is just one of to others. Just like today, these wandering souls on the Cloud Mountain actually held great power. In addition to the matter of Li Yunxin, they may also be concerned about a volcano that has been sleeping for tens of thousands of years suddenly erupting and waking up a profound realm great demon who has also been sleeping for a long time. Or a plague suddenly broke out in a certain place, and almost all the people in a country died within a month. But Bai Yanjun retreated from the world, and these ghosts ran amok in the world. Soon, one or more ghost kings would appear. Or on Cloud Mountain, some people wanted to fight, and some wanted to make peace, and even argued about the future. Any of these things was indeed more important and urgent than Li Yunxin going to Cloud Mountain at this stage. Otherwise, if he was also an opponent that needed full strength, in the Freemasonry, or the Celestial Sect, how could he have survived until today? He understood this truth, but unknowingly he also made this mistake. Chapter 440. He was a smart person. Since he had figured it out, he quickly understood. So he sighed and smiled. It seems that I think too highly of myself. In your eyes, I am not a very important person. Perhaps you have many other ways to achieve your goals. Su Yusong glanced at the 8 people and shook his head gently. Dragon King is being modest. What Dragon King said may be what they think, but not mine. For me, everything needs to change. The current situation is already very difficult. Change is needed to turn the tide. In my heart, you are that word. Li Yunxin lowered her eyes and noncommittally picked up a pottery cup from the small table on the couch and played with it in her hand. Then please continue. Su Yusong looked at the 8 people again and was silent for a while before saying, Okay, but listen to what I said. If Dragon King finds it strange and incomprehensible, please don't think that I am deceiving you. Take it as the truth for now. Then he opened his mouth. You asked me before why the elders couldn't wait to destroy the Xianmen. In fact, it's not that I don't want to say it. But at the moment, we can't be sure about this. If we don't pursue the details and only talk about the general idea, we should start from why the immortals passed down the Taoism in the human world. The immortals passed down the Taoism, established the Xianmen, and shepherded thousands of people. But in fact, what they sought was not the prosperity of humanity, but the word nurture. They want as many people as they can support, as many as a country can support. There are more and more people in the world, and eventually they will die. Where do they go after they die? To the Simluo Temple. Everyone knows that after people die, they will be reincarnated. But if this is true, 50,000 years ago, there were only thousands of people in the world, and now there are tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of people. Where did these extra souls come from? Su Yusong frowned. They are all born. Since souls can be born, then there will only be more and more. How many people have died in the past 50,000 years? More than billions, tens of billions? But where did all those souls go? They're all left behind in Dark Azura Hall and can't come back. Li Yunxin, you can think about it now. The celestial beings want to have more children in the human world. What he wanted was not a human population, but a soul. Some souls were reincarnated. Most of them were left behind, and no one knows what happened to them. Let's talk about Black Bai Yanjun of Dark Azura Hall. According to folklore, Black Bai Yanjun was originally a brother. Because he angered the celestial emperor, he was banished to the underworld and became the ruler of the netherworld. Su Yusong paused and looked straight at Li Yunxin. This legend, I found evidence from the records of the celestial sect. Do you remember that there was another major event in the history of the celestial sect of wonders? More than 40,000 years ago, certain cultivators of Daotong and Kenzo, for the sake of their own personal interests, deliberately caused turmoil in the world, causing the emperors of the world to wage war without end. As a result, there were countless casualties, causing the wrath of the celestials. Therefore, in the following 1,000 years, there was no news of the celestials. At that time, Daotong and Kenzo had not yet obtained the complete inheritance, so their cultivation realm stagnated. Many high-level cultivators, because they did not have a more profound method, aroused their inner demons and died tragically. The inheritance of the celestial sect was almost severed. Li Yunxin thought for a moment. There was indeed such a thing. Su Yusong immediately sneered. But I found a completely different description in the many ancient books of the celestial sect. At first, I found an anomaly in a pill formula. That pill formula mentioned that 40,000 years ago, there was a sword cultivator in the celestial sect, who once practiced the method personally passed down by a certain celestial being. But because he practiced the method incorrectly, he was possessed by the devil. Only this sentence was mentioned and nothing else. In a moment of curiosity, I followed this clue and investigated some other things. It took me a full year of effort before I finally pieced together the many small details scattered among hundreds of ancient books, and saw the truth. When he said this, he paused, and Li Yunxin's thoughts also paused. He noticed that Su Yusong used a word, a full year of effort. A year, compared to a person who was 1,000 years old. Was there a need to use the word full to describe it? For example, an old man who had lived for 60 years. Would he say that he had done something a full 20 days? He calmly suppressed this doubt in the bottom of his heart, listening to Su Yusong continue. The truth is, 40,000 years ago, there were actually 2 high-level cultivators, who had already cultivated to the peak of the profound realm. And at that time, no one had been able to enter the realm of supreme indifference. One day, in a dream, they received a mysterious method passed down by the celestial being, saying that this method could help them advance to the next level. So the 2 woke up from the dream and immediately began to cultivate. Who would have thought that everything was done according to the mysterious method, but they still suffered from the devil. Their inner demons were ignited, and their Tao hearts were completely lost. Soon, they fell into the devil's path. Since they became devils, they were naturally attacked by the cultivators of the world. After 3 years, they were finally killed. However, how powerful was the divine soul of a profound realm cultivator? With the remaining clear consciousness, the 2's remnant souls turned to cultivate the ghost Tao. Since they cultivated the ghost Tao, they needed the power of hope and resentment. Thus, they provoked a world war and slaughtered tens of millions of people. Then there's no telling. The 2 dreadful spectral cultivators suddenly vanished from the world without a sound. Su Yusong narrowed his eyes. Then the other thing is, before this, there was no such thing as the Dark Azura Hall, or the Black Bai Yanjun. After this there was. Li Yunxin, who do you think this Black Bai Yanjun is? Li Yunxin's heart skipped a beat. He was stunned for a moment, then frowned. You mean, the current Black Bai Yanjun is those 2 cultivators who have become devils? Su Yusong smiled but said nothing. Killing tens of millions of people, in order to make the souls of those 2 cultivators become. He pondered for a long time, not saying anything. So Su Yusong put away his smile and said those words for him. In order to make them become Black Bai Yanjun. In my opinion, the whole thing was single-handedly planned by the Celestials, in order to choose 2 people from the lower realm, to manage the souls of the dead for them. At the same time, it also warned the cultivators of the profound gate to absolutely not challenge the authority of the Celestials. Thirdly, the inheritance was broken in 1,000 years. Many of the cultivators who witnessed that matter at that time also died, so that matter is also unknown. This is killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Li Yunxin thought for a moment, his fingernail lightly tapping on the edge of the pottery cup in his palm. But, since the profound gate has already been created, why not also ask the profound gate to handle the souls of the dead for them? Su Yusong suddenly narrowed his eyes. You really are a smart person. This is the key point. Li Yunxin, think about it. How are today's profound realm cultivators compared to Black Bai Yanjun? How are today's sages compared to Black Bai Yanjun? Black Bai Yanjun in the legends is already a god. If they really came from the remnant souls of those 2 cultivators, what does it mean? It means that if the original cultivation method is obtained, and there are enough lives, then all the cultivators in the world may become that kind of existence. The Celestials can't descend to the lower realm. Then Black Bai Yanjun is the strongest on earth. If the people of the profound gate know about this, how can they be manipulated by the Celestials again? Therefore this secret must be hidden. Li Yunxin tilted his head, and thought for a moment, slightly raising his eyebrows. These things you didn't find out by yourself, did you? You're a wandering soul. If you can do so many things after possessing a body for 1,000 years, how could the sages of the past not know? Then, did the elders tell you? Some. Su Yusong sighed. But some key points. I found out more on my own. However, without those key points, what I found can't be pieced together. That's why the sages of the past can't know the truth of the matter. Li Yunxin was not very used to kneeling. Listening to him talk for so long, he felt uncomfortable. So he changed his posture, and casually glanced at the 8 people on the other side. They were still talking, and seemed to be arguing again. However, in this place his supernatural power was limited, so he couldn't hear what they were talking about. So he breathed out again. Okay, I'll take what you said at this moment as true. But what does it have to do with the elders' insistence on destroying the profound gate at this time? Do they think that, as long as the profound gate exists, those cultivators may find out such a secret at any time, may slaughter the world at any time, and become the 3rd or 4th Black Bai Yanjun? So they try to break up the profound gate, make each other's inheritance scattered, and slowly let this secret be buried. Or, as long as those high-level cultivators are there will always be a reserve for Black Bai Yanjun. But they also feel uneasy, and want to eliminate the disaster as soon as possible? Li Yunxin smiled. If you don't consider the Celestial and Black Bai Yanjun, Mr. Su, I think those elders are right. Look at this matter from your point of view. But this is undoubtedly beating the grass to scare the snake. Su Yusong looked at him seriously. The destruction of the profound gate is almost equivalent to declaring war on the Celestial and Black Bai Yanjun. The Freemasonry will immediately face a catastrophe. Because of this, we have been hiding in the shadows, and don't want to expose our identity. And because of this, we have differences with the elders. This difference is not because of personal interests, but for the common people of the world. And this reason is also the second thing I want to talk to you about. You are too ostentatious. For the sake of the world, I hope you won't let the 3 words Freemasonry be mentioned by the world too much. Li Yunxin suddenly couldn't help but laugh, but he quickly controlled his emotions. Su Yusong frowned slightly, not knowing why he laughed. But Li Yunxin waved his hand, indicating that he didn't need to care about this matter. But in fact, it was because this was the second time he heard such a point of view. For the sake of the common people of the world. The last time he heard these words was in that inn in Little Rock Canyon. A quarter of an hour after Nan Muju's summoner, by Mo, finished this sentence, he twisted the inn's waiter's neck. Chapter 441. Now he heard such words from the Freemasonry. Then he thought of the countless people they had killed. For the common people of the world. This sentence became a bitch. But he just smiled. In any world, a true gentleman and a true villain were equally rare. Only a hypocrite could dominate the world. If he didn't say it like this, what else could he say? Thus he sighed softly. Indeed, You've only given a rough idea. You must have hidden a lot of details. Maybe you don't know. As for the origin of you wandering souls, and the origin of the elders of the Freemasonry, you won't tell me. Su Yusong shook his head. These are all minor details, and have little to do with what we want to do. For now, I can't tell you. What about Namaju? Li Yunxin looked at him. You should know that the people of Namaju are also playing tricks behind my back. They are still trying to rope me in. Who are they? Su Yusong smiled. There was a hint of contempt and disdain in his smile. These people are just a group of clowns. You should know that they claim to be the old subordinates of the art saint. All they want to do is to oppose us in every way. As for why they go against us, it's just because the Freemasonry killed the art saint, so they have always held a grudge. Heh, he sneered again. But why kill the art saint? Why destroy the calligraphy saint and the sword saint? It's all because they want to cut off the inheritance of Xianmen and slowly weaken their power. This, as I said before, is for the common people of the world. Even if the saint is noble, can he compare with the fate of the people of the world? Her death is innocent but not meaningless. It's a pity that those people of Namaju are obsessed with the world. Their vision is narrow and pitiful. We just see them as clowns and don't care about them. Li Yunxin nodded calmly and softly said, "Oh." His attitude could not be seen. Su Yusong saw him like this and said, "What we need to do now, Sai, is actually compromise and forbearance. The elders want Xianmen to be destroyed. We can't change their minds. All we can do is try our best to preserve some of our strength. When the world's righteous path collapses, at least the human world will not lose its restraints and become a complete mess." Li Yunxin nodded slightly. He lowered his head and thought for a while. "So, what you want me to do now is to reveal the situation of the demons to you. Next, you guys can make the necessary arrangements." He selectively conserved his strength in the coming catastrophe. At the very least, we still retain the minimum control and influence over the dynasty in the human world. An imperceptible light flashed in Su Yusong's eyes. Then, he looked at Li Yunxin and smiled thoughtfully. "Dragon King, the way you say this is very much like the elders." Li Yunxin giggled. "Could it be that you don't know the ins and outs of the elders?" Su Yusong paused. "I've never seen them." Li Yunxin let out another "oh" before falling silent. He knew that Su Yusong was not telling the truth. In other words, he knew that the so-called truth Su Yusong just said should be mixed. The most brilliant lie was 9 truths and 1 falsehood. Only 1 or 2 key points could change the whole truth. However, he didn't know what the key point Su Yusong was talking about was. The reason why he had such an idea was that he knew the star formation in Changji Town. Yu Meng claimed that there was once a celestial named Shun Mu in the human world. Not long ago, the star formation in Changji Town was reactivated, and Yu Meng recovered his memory. But the problem was that the celestial named Shun Mu made such an incredible formation. Was it just to let Yu Meng recover his memory? Or he actually had some other purpose, and Yu Meng was just helping him casually in this matter? Did this mean there was a celestial in this world now? But if there was, where was he, and what was he doing? If the Freemasonry had always wanted to compete with the celestial, did they really know nothing about this matter? Moreover, he had a lot of dealings with Bai Yanjun. He had been brought into the Sun Luo Hell, and stayed in the prison that imprisoned souls for a period of time. So he knew that Black Bai Yanjun was looking for someone, and mistook him for that person. He also knew that there seemed to be someone behind Black Bai Yanjun, who was above the two of them. He also knew that the Black and White Yama Lords also hoped that the demons and the Celestial Sect of Wonders would fight fiercely, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Freemasons and the enemies of the Freemasons, the Black and White Yama Lords, actually had the same goal. And most importantly, Black Bai Yanjun knew that he was a traveler. Based on this alone, their identity couldn't be as simple as the souls of celestial realm cultivators who had been possessed by the devil. Li Yunxin sighed in his heart. After hearing so much inside information, he thought that his thoughts would be clearer. Now that he thought about it, it was even more confusing. One side must be lying. Seeing that he pondered for a while and didn't say anything, Su Yusong simply leaned back and stood up. I think Dragon King also needs some time to think about it slowly. Then don't rush. Think about it slowly and decide whether or not to tell us those things. Also, does Dragon King have the translucent jade slip with him? Li Yunxin didn't stand up with him. He shook his head. No. Su Yusong twirled his beard and smiled. No rush, no rush. Dragon King can think about it here for 10 days or half a month. It won't be difficult. Seeing that Li Yunxin was about to speak, he waved his hand. I think you also don't know that this little cloud mountain has another advantage. Although divine abilities are restricted, a day here can be long or short. For example, right now Dragon King has talked with me for so long, but outside, only a moment has passed. As he said this, he turned his wrist. Then a transparent circle suddenly appeared in the void. This arc slowly stabilized and actually reflected the scenery outside the cloud mountain. Su Yusong smiled. This is a small trick. You need to know that there are always exceptions. So, Dragon King doesn't need to worry about the Zither lady's restriction. Don't worry. There was no accurate way to measure time in this world. It was also night time, so it was difficult to find any reference. But the scene that appeared in the mirror was very familiar to Li Yunxin. When he and Xi and Shilio went to the cloud mountain, they took the flying shuttle. When they first entered the flying shuttle, its surface was not covered with frost, so Li Yunxin saw a long trail in the air. The trail should be made of water vapor. Now, the scene in the mirror seemed to be the night sky not far from the cloud mountain. On the dark and starry sky, there was a faint white trail. Su Yusong casually pushed the mirror with his hand, so that Li Yunxin could see it more clearly. He could even see the gravel on the rock wall and the tiny water droplets in the air. The water droplets were slowly spreading, but the spreading was extremely slow, as if time had stopped. The flow of time in the outside world and in the cloud mountain did seem to be different. But what Li Yunxin saw was not those tiny water droplets. His eyes were focused on the rock wall. Su Yusong might have used an illusion to deceive him, but when he saw the scene in the mirror, he knew that it was not a fake, because his eyes could see very far and very fine places through the small mirror. As long as his eyesight was good enough, he could see clearly. This was something that illusions could not do. Because of this, he saw that there were actually many stone rooms on the rock wall. There were doors and windows in the stone rooms, but they were only outlines. They could not block the wind and rain. In fact, it was the opposite. People were locked in this stone room, and when they stepped out of the door, they would be in the cold sky. If they did not know how to fly, they would definitely fall to pieces. It was a natural prison. In one of the stone rooms, Li Yunxin saw a familiar figure. He frowned and subconsciously stood up, staring at the figure. Seeing him like this, Su Yusong smiled again. He stretched out his hand and fiddled in the air. Then the scene in the mirror came into his face, and everything was magnified. Li Yunxin clearly saw the person in the stone room. It was an old man, with white hair on both sides of his temples. But his beard was black. He wore a gray Taoist robe. He was sitting cross-legged on a stone bed in the room, with his palms and feet facing the sky, his eyes closed in meditation. The strong wind in the sky howled into the room, causing his beard, hair, and robe sleeves to flutter loudly. Presumably, it was extremely cold, because this person's face was ashen, and there was frost under his nose and on the side of his lips. As he breathed out mist, but it was quickly torn apart by the strong wind. Li Yunxin recognized him. This person was surnamed Lu, and his name was Gongzan. Su Yusong waited for him to look for half an hour, then said, "If you talk to him here, he can hear you. Dragon King, do you want to say a few words?" Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then his brows slowly relaxed. He lightly sighed. "No need. Fine." Su Yusong waved his hand in the air, brushing away the mirror in the air. "I only heard about this person from Jin Guangzi recently. He was originally a capable subordinate of Dragon King, but was captured and brought to Cloud Mountain. When he came to Cloud Mountain, he was quite honest and stable. So Jin Guangzi told me that this person was very smart and scheming. Should we refine him into a wandering soul and accept him as our brother?" Su Yusong smiled and shook his head. "But I thought it was inappropriate. Not everyone can become a wandering soul. The difficulty is unimaginable. Maybe only 1 in 10,000 souls can succeed. So I put it aside. But he looked at Li Yunxin. Recently, this person has been restless. It turned out that it was all a disguise. It seemed that he used some tricks to spread some news outside Cloud Mountain. So he was punished to reflect in a stone cave with strong wind. In the past, 2 of Dragon King's subordinates were captured and brought to Cloud Mountain, and they were also imprisoned in such a place. I originally thought, "Don't you have anything else to do, Mr. Su?" Li Yunxin sat in front of the bed, his eyes drooping, suddenly interrupted him. Su Yusung was stunned, but then he smiled. "Okay, Dragon King wants to meditate, then I won't disturb him." Then he turned around and left, walked to the side of the 8 people who were talking, and seemed to discuss something else with them. Li Yunxin sat quietly in front of the small table on the bed, holding the small ceramic cup in his hand, slowly turning it, and gently knocking it on the table. It seemed that he was indeed thinking about something. About a quarter of an hour later, the matter seemed to have been discussed. So 2 cultivators cupped their hands and left. The rest of the people chatted for a while, and then 2 people also left. Then another person also left. Li Yusin looked up at him. That person's gaze met Li Yunxin's, and then quickly moved away. It was as if he saw some flowers and birds, and he didn't even bother to nod. Then the last 2 cultivators also disappeared into the dense forest. Scholar Su Yusung and Sword Saint Zhuomuja turned to Li Yunxin together and said, "Dragon King, do you like this place, or do you want to stay with us on the mountain? I won't bother you 2 anymore." Li Yunxin smiled, revealing 8 teeth. Su Yusung also smiled. "Okay, we still have a lot of things to deal with, so we can't accompany Dragon King for the time being. Since it was Lady Shilio who invited Dragon King to Cloud Mountain, let her come with Dragon King. If there's anything, you can tell her." Li Yunxin nodded. It couldn't be better. Sword Saint also nodded at him, raised his hand. Immediately, 2 birds flew over from the forest. The 2 sages, who were possessed by the wandering souls, leaped lightly and stepped on the birds' backs. Then they lightly flew straight to the small mountain in the sky. After a dozen breaths, the forest became completely quiet. After a few more breaths, the insects began to cry softly. The birds in the forest also began to sing, and it became lively again. Li Yunxin sat motionless on the bed, as if he had already entered a meditative state. At this moment, the 2 sages had just landed in the long corridor of the floating mountain. Looking down at the vast forest from here, one could only see a stretch of verdant greenery. There was no difference, and it was even more difficult to see where Li Yunxin was. After a dozen breaths, Sword Saint Su Muja finally spoke. "How is it? He believed your act." Su Yusung narrowed his eyes and said softly, "But this person is very stubborn. I first told him some inside information. Some truth and some lies, some truth and some truth. It seems that he also knows about it. Logically speaking, with such kindness he should be grateful. But he still didn't say anything. Humph." He paused for a moment then shook his head. "So, I showed him that Lu Gongzan. He didn't react. But when I looked at him, I still cared. It's just that he knew that I had already begun to be impolite to him, and was somewhat angry. So he purposely didn't let his thoughts show. In the past, I underestimated him." Su Yusung was silent for a while, then flicked his sleeves. "But he's still under control. Through him, I've also dragged Nan Muju into this catastrophe. Humph, cleverness is always fooled by cleverness. Now, let's see if he's smart enough." Therefore he sent this young girl, who was also a Taoist painter, and knew his methods better. Li Yunxin withdrew his hand, and turned to look at her. He saw that she had changed her clothes, and in her hand was a wooden box inlaid with brass. There was a slight smile on her face, and her hair was combed into 2 buns. She looked like a little maid on an outing in spring. Seeing that Li Yunxin did not speak, Exa and Shilio hopped over a few dead trees and came over. "Dragon King, how was the talk just now?" Li Yunxin thought for a moment. "Not much. That's why I asked you to monitor me. I probably have to stay here for a long time. Exai Shilyo smiled again. It's also a good thing. This is a good job that I've been looking forward to. Previously, Dragon King said that he did not have too much time, but now he does. You can think about it slowly here, and then teach me slowly. As she said that, she lifted the wooden box in her hand. I brought my painting tools. Dragon King, do you want to walk again? Or do you want to relieve your boredom now? Li Yunxin would not use the method of practicing painting to relieve boredom. But just as he was about to open his mouth to refuse, he saw Exai Shilyo winking at him playfully. So his heart skipped a beat, and he remembered something. Before, Su Yusong had shown him his supernatural power. This place forbade supernatural power, but he did not know why his method could be used. This meant that, if Su Yusong wanted to see, he might have a way to see what they were doing now, and hear what they were saying now. If Exai Shilyo was indeed from Munanju, it would be difficult for her to say these secret words to him. Maybe she was trying to use this method to communicate with him. So he nodded and smiled. Okay. The two returned to the tree shed in the dense forest, and sat down at a small table. Exai Shilyo opened the wooden box, and took out a night-luminescent pearl. She put it in the lampstand on the table, and it emitted a soft light. Then she took out the brushes, ink, paper, and inkstones one by one from the box, and placed them on the table. Then she looked at Li Yunxin. Dragon King, don't you have anything to say, and no one to see? Li Yunxin looked into her eyes, and recalled what she had said to her when she woke up. She said that she wanted to use his coming to Yunshan to find a legitimate reason to move around. But now that she was accompanying him, there was no room for her to move around. She wanted. Li Yunxin narrowed his eyes and understood. As a member of Mu Nanju, Exai Shilyo wanted to go around. As a member of the Freemasonry, she was here to monitor him and try to get some information from him to find some weaknesses. Then, there was one thing he could do to satisfy the purpose of these two identities at the same time. So he thought for a while and sighed. Fine. You, help me bring a painting for someone. Grind the ink. Hearing his order, Exai Shilyo became happy. It seemed that she was excited about the fact that she could finally see the best painter in the world to try his skills. She took some water and added it to the inkstone. Then she took out an ink stick, pulled up her sleeve with her left hand, and slowly ground it. Not long after, the inkstone was full of thick ink. At this moment, Li Yunxin took out a brush, wet the brush in the brush washer, and rubbed it on the table. The rice paper pressed on the table felt very good, reminding him of the past. The past referred to the appearance of his parents in this life when they were in the mountain village. In fact, it was only a few months. But now when he thought about the past, it was like recalling the dream he had last night. At that time, he still had the state of mind of a Taishang. He only saw many things, but he did not have many feelings in his heart. For example, he knew that sometimes when he pretended to play in the garden, his mother Shengguanyu would look at him from the porch, holding on to the wooden pillar that had become smooth and round because of the long years. Often she would look at him for half an hour. At that time, he knew that the woman did it because of love. Maybe there were other reasons, the reason of fear that the good time will pass one day. But he only knew it before. Now, he felt a slight sourness in his chest. But there were many things that he could not understand at that time. Thinking about it later was like a dream in the fog. What had passed could not be recovered, and he could only regret it. At that time, he often used this kind of paper to practice painting. After he escaped from that place, because he became a demon, and his magic power became stronger, he had not touched this kind of paper for a long time. He sighed softly and spat out the sourness in his chest on the paper. He tapped the ink stone with the tip of the brush. The snow-white tip of the brush immediately absorbed the ink. He casually hooked, and drew back on the painting, and outlined the blade of a sword. Only half of the blade was drawn. It was as thin as a cicada's wing, as if it came out of a snow-white mist. If he looked at it for a long time, he could even feel the blade trembling slightly, as if it would be in front of him in the next moment. Exai Shilyo held her breath, and stared at Li Yunxin's every stroke without blinking. When he drew the sword, he thought of Li Chunfeng again. Li Chunfeng, was his biological father in this world. In fact, his impression of him was probably deeper than Shang Guanyu's. Before he escaped from the mountain village, his painting skills were all taught by that man. In fact, he could speak since he was born, but in order not to attract attention, he pretended to be babbling for a period of time. Later, he got bored and stopped. After one night, he began to speak fluently. He remembered that Li Chunfeng laughed very happily at that time, saying that he was indeed a Taoist, destined to be extraordinary. It should have been a happy thing. However, after he said that, he became silent again. Li Yunxin didn't understand at that time, but now he understood. He was a Taoist with extraordinary talent, but he had to live in seclusion with them in this mountain village, and maybe he had to spend his life as a mortal. Both he and Shang Guanyu were extremely talented people. How could they be willing to let their children be like this? Later, they finally taught him some painting skills, but they didn't tell him much about the cultivation world, and rarely talked about other things. Maybe it was because of this contradictory mentality. He was not willing to be buried, but he was afraid that one day, these skills would be put to use. Now he thought about these two people. They were the first people who really cared about him in this world. But they were both dead. He killed Qing Liangzi in the city of Wei. However, this matter was not over yet. Far from it. He sighed for the second time. He turned his wrist, so that the tip of the brush was facing up. When he used the brush to wash and moisten the brush, he left a few drops of water on the edge. Then, he used the brush to quickly swirl the water droplets on the edge of the brush. The ink at the tip of the brush seeped into the belly of the brush with the water, turning into light ink. So he used the brush again, and in front of the sword edge, he quickly made 2 strokes with the belly of the brush. Then, an ink-colored scale appeared vividly on the paper. But this almost triangular scale was split. Looking at the meaning of the painting, it seemed to be cut by the thin blade of the cicada's wing. Xi and Shilyo looked at it quietly. Seeing this, she frowned slightly. It was a very big piece of paper. However, Li Yunxin's blade and the scale only occupied a small part of the right side. There was still a lot of space. She couldn't understand what this Wei River Dragon King wanted to say with this painting. At this moment, Li Yunxin turned his wrist again and shook the brush. So most of the ink on the tip of the brush was thrown out. Next, he looked into the inkstone again. This time, he dipped it in the ink. In this way, the tip of the brush was very dry, and even slightly branched. But he didn't care. He frowned slightly, and began to write on the left side of the paper. Xi and Shilyo was curious, so she looked more carefully at this time. The first line was, "Drink wine and enjoy yourself." Then the second line, "Human feelings turn over like waves." After writing these words, the ink was already very dry. The handwriting was like the weeds that had fallen on the rock wall during the drought. One could feel the desolation and loneliness at a glance. When Li Yunxin wrote these 2 lines, he frowned again. His writing was fast and sharp, and there was a hint of fierceness in the desolation. He seemed to be angry. Xi and Shilyo took a deep breath and leaned back a little. Then Li Yunxin dipped the ink in the inkstone again and continued to write the 3rd and 4th lines. The White Prime Minister still presses his sword. The Vermilion First Master laughs at the crown. Xi and Shilyo was a Taoist painter, but she was also proficient in poetry. She wasn't an expert, but she could still distinguish between good and bad. She first knew that Li Yunxin was the one with the highest cultivation in painting at that time, because Li Yunxin's realm was the highest. He was in the true state, while the Taoist painters on Mount Yunshan were only in the transcendent state. She knew that his realm was high, but she didn't know how good his painting skills were. She knew that Li Yunxin didn't have a proper inheritance when he was young, and it was impossible for him to concentrate on painting after he became a demon. Therefore, she felt that he should be better than her. But this brilliance might be more because of his realm. But now, she sat at the table and frowned slightly. She didn't know what to say. Supernatural powers were forbidden here. The paintings he made were just ordinary paintings. But it was such a thing, coupled with such a poem. She felt that the murderous aura was overflowing, as if it was about to burst out from every stroke. She was so shocked that she felt a slight pain in her lungs when she breathed. Purely in terms of painting skills, how could he be so strong? However, looking at the 4 lines of his poem, based on her limited knowledge, these 4 lines were also excellent. Even if she couldn't truly understand the profound meaning of every sentence, she could still, just by looking at the words, she could see it in a fleeting manner. The 4 lines of the poem were about drinking with old friends, trying to extinguish the hidden bitterness in their hearts. But even if they were friends who had known each other for many years, they still had to put their hands on the hilt of the sword to prevent him from harming them. And when he becomes successful, if you count on him to promote you and take care of you, it will only make people laugh. She read the 4 lines in her heart again. She felt that the poem was excellent. But this poetry, this painting meaning, she was slightly stunned and said in a low voice, "Dragon King, is this a gift for Lu Gongzan?" Li Yunxin was silent at first. The brush stopped at the end of the 4th line, as if he wanted to continue, but he was hesitant. Hearing her question, he only smiled. Xi and Shilyo knew that it was a tacit agreement. At this moment, her mind was completely attracted by the painting and the poem. After thinking carefully for a while, she frowned slightly. These 4 lines are naturally good, but it seems that they haven't had enough. Dragon King, there's nothing else. Li Yunxin was silent for a while again. Suddenly, he exerted some force in his fingers and broke the pen in his hand, throwing it on the ground. There's nothing else. He stood up slowly and looked down at the painting again. Then he turned around and flicked his sleeves. "Give it to Lu Gongzan on my behalf." Chapter 443. Li Yunxin threw away his brush and walked to a giant tree outside the house. He stood there with his hands behind his back, as if he was looking into the distance. At this moment, the sunlight from the dome shone through the gaps of the leaves and enveloped him. She could only see the green and misty scenery in the distance. Li Yunxin's tall and slender figure was bathed in the golden sunlight alone. The giant tree beside him was like the pillars of a giant god's palace. The solemnity and grandeur formed a strong contrast with his personal sadness. It was like a colorful painting that was fixed in Xi and Shilyo's heart. At this moment, she suddenly felt, the so-called Wei River Dragon King, the peerless demon, might know more about love than most people. But she hurriedly took a deep breath and shook her head gently, trying to expel this sudden feeling from her chest, and only focusing on the painting. But she thought of the way Li Yunxin behaved and smiled when she first met him. A strange feeling gradually spread in her heart. It was strange because Xi and Shilyo knew very well that this feeling had nothing to do with love. However, since it had nothing to do with love, and he had only met Li Yunxin and interacted with her for just a few hours, why was it that she was starting to slowly become easily stirred up by him? It was as if he had cast a spell on her. She frowned because of this thought. She felt that she might be thinking too much. After all, it was her first time seeing a painting cultivator outside of Yunshan, and his skill was so profound. Therefore, it was reasonable for her to be shocked. Li Yunxin was a dangerous person. He was thinking of this. She took a deep breath. She seemed to have thought of something and said softly, "Dragon King, did you think of something sad?" Although he did not have supernatural power, he still had the cultivation of his body. There was no other sound in the forest except for the chirping of birds and insects. Therefore, even if she spoke softly, she could still hear it clearly. After listening to her words, Li Yunxin slightly tilted his head to look at her after a while. "How can I be sad?" The faint golden light shone on the side of his face. The contours of his face were clear and distinct. It was as beautiful as a painting drawn by the most brilliant Taoist priest. So beautiful that it was a complete mess. This scene made Xi and Shilyo's heart skip a beat. However, she suppressed this jump and took a deep breath. She hurriedly smiled and said, "I thought Dragon King was thinking of those girls who used to be by his side. In Shuerwa by Yunshin Hong Nyangzi. Dragon King played with them and hurt their hearts. Don't you feel sad when you think about it now?" She herself did not know why. As he said these words, he felt somewhat unhappy. She almost shut her mouth and sat there silently, not wanting to see his face again. But he couldn't let it go. After saying these words, she regretted it. Her heart was suddenly in her throat, as if it was hanging in the air. However, she didn't know why it was hanging in the air. Therefore, she saw a smile suddenly appear on Li Yunxin's face. Obviously, the corner of his mouth was slightly raised. She didn't know if it was because of his long and thick eyelashes slightly drooping, casting a faint shadow on his cheeks. She suddenly felt that his smile was a little gloomy and looked very lonely. "What do you mean by playing?" He smiled like this, but his voice was a little sad. He squinted his eyes, looked at the sky and sighed softly. The word lonely, when taken apart, a boy playing in the shade of a melon field, a thin dog chasing insects and butterflies in an alley. But this lively scene belongs to others, and has nothing to do with me. This is loneliness. No one understands me, no one accompanies me. At this time, I really want to hold on to something. His voice was light and clear. It was like the sound of green leaves falling in the bright sunshine of a distant summer, or like the crackling sound next to a warm fire in winter. It sounded gentle and sad, as if a heavy breath would startle him. Many people say some sincere words, and make vows at many times. Then as time passes, the words are forgotten, the vows are broken. People say that they are playing. Li Yunxin said as he slowly turned around. His cheek was hidden in the shadow, glowing with cold light. The other cheek was bathed in the golden light, warm and soft. But when those vows of undying love are said, how will others know that they are not sincere? A lonely person is like a drowning person. He will want to grab everyone around him and ask him to break free. He will want to find someone to share his love with. As for whether that person is suitable or not, it's not something a drowning person will consider. Saying such a thing is playing. Don't you think it's also a very cruel way of saying it? Exan Shilio's heart that was hanging in suspense suddenly fell down. This fall seemed to have fallen into the snow mountain and ocean of qi, stirring up something. Soft emotions bubbled up in her chest. She hurriedly took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed them. But there was a subtle feeling in her heart, as if a little surprise and relief were mixed together. But there was a little bit of bitterness in it. It was this kind of emotion that drove her to say something unconsciously. So Dragon King treated them sincerely, but later he felt that they were not suitable. So they separated? That sounds like a man of love and righteousness. Li Yunxin smiled again with sadness in his smile. That Yin Shuerua. I just arrived in city of Wei when I met her. I was lonely and had no one to rely on. She fell in love with me and accompanied me every day. How could I not admire her? But she died tragically. Do you know who did it? Exan Shilio opened her mouth. But after a pause she just said, I know a little. So you also know what happened to that person later? Li Yunxin sighed. Who knows if I killed him for myself or for her? And that red madam also treats me with sincerity. He smiled miserably. I am a lonely person. How could I not love her sincerely? However, I still have a grudge against her father, Mr. Dongting. How can I bear to put her in the middle and put her in a dilemma? So you should know another sentence. Letting go is the last gentleness I can give you. When Li Yunxin said this, he slightly frowned. In Exan Shilio's eyes, this slight frown seemed to indicate a painful emotion. Because of this, she was stunned. It was the first time she heard such words, and she was a little stunned. She only felt that these words were clever and pleasant to hear. But it was really sad and helpless. She really wanted to hear it again. But she didn't know what to say. She even regretted asking about Li Yunxin's sad story. However, Li Yunxin slightly closed his eyes and let out a long breath. By Yunxin, what kind of person do you think she is? The proud daughter of the Golden Rock King, who has walked the world for thousands of years. How could someone like me, who is just like a wandering ghost, be worthy of her? The emotions she gave me, I don't dare to accept it. When he said this, his eyelashes slightly trembled, and he suddenly turned his back. After a long silence, he shook his head and laughed. But this time, his laughter was clear and crisp, without a trace of sadness. Ha! I was just joking. After all, it's just playing. He laughed repeatedly, but did not turn his head. You were also fooled. But Exan Shilio did not laugh. Instead she sighed. A sad, desolate, and lonely person was pitiful. But since he was sad and desolate, he could not easily show these emotions, and could only use a smile to cover it up seemed to be more pitiful. Li Yunqin. What kind of person was he? Thinking of this, she could not help but lower her head to look at the 4 lines of the poem that Li Yunqin had inscribed on the painting. Drinking wine with you. Everyone is at ease. Human emotions are like waves. The white prime minister knows but still presses his sword. The vermilion gate is the first to laugh. The strong emotions hidden in these 4 lines almost broke through the surface of the paper. To be able to write such a poem, what kind of understanding, what kind of emotions, what kind of person? Li Yunqin. What kind of person was he? She finally could not help but ask again. These 4 lines, were they pretentious by the Dragon King? Li Yunqin was silent for a while, but did not turn his head. Oh! He first responded. After a full 3 breaths of time he lightly said, "It's someone else's poem. I copied it." Xian Shilyo pursed her lips. Such a poem should be quite famous in the world. The Xianmen accepted worship from all over the world. This worship was not only gold and silver utensils and delicacies. There were also poems and essays. Poems and essays were one of the most dazzling treasures in the secular world. When humanity flourished, the country was prosperous, and the people were at peace, there would be magnificent essays passed down. This was enough to show the great achievements of the Xianmen in shepherding the world. Therefore, the secular dynasties would do their best to collect beautiful poems and essays every year and offer them together. Cultivators had a long life. This kind of thing was naturally one of the few beneficial pastimes for them, so they had enough time and leisure to appreciate those things. However, Xian Shilyo had never heard of such an outstanding 4 lines. He used a sudden smile to hide the pain in his heart. And now, as usual, she had thrown these 4 beautiful lines that expressed her feelings to a non-existent bystander. He was such a Li Yunqin. Therefore she did not speak anymore. Sitting at the small table, she slowly kept the painting and carefully put it into the wooden box. After a moment of silence she said, "Dragon King, tell me something else. Can you tell me about your learning to paint?" In the following 2 hours, Li Yunqin told her a lot about his learning to paint. His words and demeanor were very plain. However, if one carefully observed this plainness, one could see that it was the result of deliberate suppression. And the content of what he said was also very plain and calm. However, a smart person like Xian Shilyo could also hear that, in fact, he had experienced the vicissitudes of life, and then slowly rose to the beach like the tide after a storm. It seemed to be a kind of calmness after a vigorous event. It was impossible for a person who did not have burning emotions in his heart to have such comprehension and calmness. After 2 hours, this Taoist priest's heart seemed to be full of confusion and doubts. The Li Yunqin in front of him was indeed very different from the Li Yunqin in the world's mouth. In reality, he was a person who valued relationships very much and cherished them very much. But the tragic fate and the rough world made him have no choice but to bury many emotions deep in his heart and cover himself with a cold and cunning mask. In fact, there was evidence. For example, his feelings for Lu Gongzan. People around him came and went, but only Lu Gongzan, who was ordinary, always occupied a place in his heart. This showed that he was indeed a person with a heart. It was just that many people ignored this point. This was what Xian Shilyo thought in her heart when she left with the wooden box and the painting scroll in the box. Her figure finally disappeared in the dense forest, and the sky slowly darkened. Li Yunqin was still sitting alone in the forest house. Through a small gap in the dense canopy in front of him, he watched the dome of this space slowly turn from blue to orange. After watching for a quarter of an hour, he suddenly shook his head and chuckled. These people. It was really strange. They were always very confident in themselves. For example, Xian Shilyo. How could Li Yunqin not see it? After he met Xian Shilyo and confirmed her identity, he decided to slowly break through her heart and get something from her. This matter should be a little difficult. No matter how clever his means and how powerful his charm was, it was difficult to make a clear-minded and vigilant person lose their mind in a short time. He might be able to use more radical means to make that person reveal her heart in a short time, but that was not a long-term solution. Later, he would be discovered, and there would be endless trouble. But the wonderful thing was that no matter who Xianxilio was, she was also trying to get him. When Li Yunxin saw her for the first time, she felt a strange emotion in her heart. Then he quickly found the source of the strange feeling. Xianxilio was actually very similar to a person, a low-quality version of the art saint. It was said that the art saint's beauty was unparalleled in the world, and Xianxilio's appearance could be considered as the face of a flower and the moon. The art saint was the supreme master of painting, and he was one of the few peers of Li Yunxin in the world. Xianxilio was also a Taoist priest of painting. The first time they met, she showed him a sense of intimacy. According to the legend, the art saint's temperament was quite strong. However, according to the clues she left in the world, Li Yunxin found that this strong art saint actually had a lively side. And this Xianxilio was also like this when dealing with Ku Chanzi. She called herself a witch and did not care. Such a smart and beautiful girl, who was neither good nor evil, and had a good relationship with Li Yunxin. Wasn't she just a low-quality version of the art saint? It was not a coincidence that she appeared in front of him like this, but the result of a deliberate arrangement. The purpose was obvious. Someone had once planned to use the art saint to break his supreme indifference. And now, they were planning to use Xianxilio to make him feel other emotions. This woman, in fact, was also quietly leading him into a trap. So, under the situation where this woman also took the initiative to cooperate with him half-heartedly, if he still couldn't do something, how could he still be considered the devil Li Yunxin? He really hoped that Xianxilio would meet his match, and meet a talented general. Things like making things real could also make people happy and comforted. Li Yunxin repeated these words in his heart 3 times. He didn't close his eyes until he felt that the last bit of uneasiness in his heart was suppressed. The forest became darker and darker. His first night in Mount Shaoyan had arrived. Chapter 444. In the middle of the night, the wind rushed and roared in every corner of the stone room. This stone cave had been attacked by the wind for thousands of years. Every stone wall had become smooth and flat, and every corner was free of dirt. Only Lao Dao was there. His face was pale and his hair was messy. He had been sitting in the wind for a long time. But in the next moment, the wind suddenly stopped. A huge red-crowned crane flew in front of the door. The woman lightly jumped down from the crane's back and waved her hand. The crane immediately turned into a talisman and fell into her palm. So she took 2 steps forward and drew a few strokes on the stone wall. A small delicate lamp squeezed out of the wall and illuminated the stone room. Then she wiped the stone door and the stone window, a white and translucent window paper that could block the wind, and cold also appeared in the air. The room became quiet. The old Taoist opened his eyes and saw Xianxilio standing 3 steps away from him with a wooden box in her hand. He didn't say anything and only looked at her. His face was expressionless. The woman also looked at him for a while and suddenly smiled. The room was filled with the feeling of spring. In 2 days, I saw 2 Taoist priests from outside the Cloud Mountain. No one would believe me if I told them about this. She began to speak softly. She walked over to the old Taoist and placed the wooden box on the wide stone bed. She lifted the lid with her slender fingers. A strong aroma of wine and meat hit their noses. Lao Dao's face was still expressionless, but his throat did move. Then, Xianxilio slowly took out the things in the wooden box. First was a pot of wine, a silver pot with 2 small silver cups. It was made of gold thread and inlaid with soybean-sized rubies. It was very beautiful. Then there was a braised chicken wing. It was golden in color with crispy skin and tender meat. It was served on an ebony plate and placed next to Lao Dao's legs. There was also a plate of salted peanuts. Each of them was round and oily, and there were small grains of sparkling salt on them. There were only 3 of them, but obviously they were all exquisite. They looked and smelled good. Xianxilio closed the wooden box and placed it on the ground. Then, she sat on the edge of the bed with her legs tilted to one side and folded her hands on her lap. "One is you, and the other is Li Yunxin. You won't believe it, but he saw you in the looking glass this afternoon. But he didn't speak. Lao Dao blinked and frowned. Finally, he turned to look at her. But his gaze only skimmed over her face for a moment before landing on the food. Xian Shilyo laughed and said, "You are only an emptiness realm expert. I'm about to run out of energy after all these days. Let's eat first." Lao Dao was silent for 3 breaths before he said, "You." When he said the first word, his voice was as rusty as a piece of iron that had been buried in the soil for 100 years. Thus he coughed violently and squeezed out the following words. "Who is it?" Xian Shilyo stopped smiling and looked at him. Suddenly she cast her eyes downwards. Lao Dao was slightly taken aback by the playful look in his eyes. But he quickly understood and looked in the direction of her gaze. In her sleeve, a translucent jade slip flashed and disappeared. Then Xian Shilyo laughed again. "Me? Of course you are from Mount Shaoyan. The sage has invited Li Yunxin as a guest. He is now on Mount Shaoyan. Since he is here, and you are his loyal servant, I can't neglect you. Perhaps in 2 days, you will be able to see him. So if you don't take care of your body, what will you do in the future?" Lu Gongzan was slightly taken aback. After 2 breaths, he looked at her again. Finally, he reached out his hand slowly and picked up the wine pot. He was eating on the right side of his body, but now, he had to use his left hand to turn around. Xian Shilyo's gaze lingered on his right arm for a while. Lu Gongzan hooked his sleeve with his finger. Xian Shilyo furrowed her brows and looked away. His forearm under the sleeve was completely rotten. It seemed that there was a finger-long wound on his arm. There was a thick layer of blood scab on the wound, but it should be pus under the blood scab. From both sides, up to his elbows, down to his wrists, tiny wounds densely covered every inch of his skin. Each wound was filled with blood, as if it would gush out at the slightest clench of his fist. It was rotten to this extent, but it didn't kill him. It could be said that the body of an emptiness realm cultivator had been tempered. Lu Gongzan only smiled when he saw her like this. He didn't use the wine pot. He hooked the handle of the silver pot with his finger and lifted it high. He poured the wine into a line and put it down his throat. He drank half of the pot in one breath and put it down. He smacked his lips again and frowned. "This is..." Li Yunxin said that you like to drink Mu Nanshan the most. Isn't this it? You also use this to entertain him. Xian Shilyo observed his every move. Her voice was still soft and gentle. Lu Gongzan didn't speak anymore. It seemed that the wine bug and the gluttonous bug in his stomach were awakened at the same time. He reached out and picked the pile of peanuts. One by one, the peanuts jumped up and jumped into his mouth. Seeing that he was chewing the peanuts, Xian Shilyo stood up. She turned her palm again and took out a scroll from her sleeve. It had already been framed. "Li Yunxin asked me to bring you something," she said softly. "He said that you will understand when you see it." Hearing this, Lu Gongzan suddenly raised his head and stared at the scroll in her hand. Xian Shilyo slowly unfolded it from right to left. She first revealed half of the blade and a broken scale, then stopped. Seeing these 2 things, Lu Gongzan's body leaned back slightly. The murderous aura in the painting. Now that he saw it, his reaction was the same as Xian Shilyo's. He felt that his throat was tight, and his heart was beating wildly, as if his body was soaked by coldness. "It's his handwriting." Lu Gongzan's lips trembled slightly. He tried hard to spit out this sentence. His eyes seemed to be a little frightened. He said, "There's more, there's more." Xian Shilyo saw his reaction, and then unfolded the scroll again. First, she left a large piece of blank space. Then she saw the first line of the poem. Lu Gongzan's lips trembled again. He slowly exhaled from his chest. The qi was burning hot, and a little trembling. When he saw the first sentence, the fear and apprehension in his heart disappeared. Instead, it was replaced by an even more intense emotion. Xian Shilyo smiled and showed the second line. "Human feelings are like waves." Lu Gongzan raised his hand and wiped the corners of his eyes with his sleeve. He didn't care about Xian Shilyo's presence and didn't feel embarrassed. He muttered to himself, "Alas, brother Xian, alas, brother Xian." He sighed in a low voice for a while and wiped his tears. His face finally had some color. Then, Exa and Shilio showed the third and fourth lines. The White Emperor still presses his sword when he knows, and the Vermilion family is the first to arrive with a smile. After staring at these 2 lines for 3 breaths without blinking, the color on Lu Gongzan's face disappeared in an instant. It was as if all the blood in his body had gone cold. His body jerked back again. Then, as if something behind him had punched him hard, he fell forward again. Puff! He spat out a big mouthful of blood. Exa and Shilio looked at him coldly. She slowly put the scroll back into her sleeve. Lu Gongzan spat out another mouthful of blood. He suddenly looked up as if he was looking for the painting, but he couldn't find it. So he just stared at Exa and Shilio. What else did he say? What else did he say? Exa and Shilio looked at him with pity and slightly lowered her eyes. Lu Gongzan, we know that you risked your life to be brought to Yunshan to give Li Yunxin a way out. Before that, you risked your life to inform Li Yunxin about the gold photon. But you have to know, she thought for a while inside, he is a very suspicious person. Even if he knows that everything you did was for him, he can't tolerate you anymore. You killed the 2 demons for him this time, which is already something he doesn't know how to evaluate. In his eyes, you're already doing things too crazily. It's beyond his control. So, you asked me what else he said. She smiled. He also said, sometimes letting go is the last tenderness. You should know what this means. He is grateful for what you did for him last time. However, at his place he didn't kill you. From now on we are strangers. That's already a thank you. Sometimes it's time to let go, let go. Lu Gongzan mumbled these words a few times in his mouth. Suddenly, tears flowed down his face. It's also his words, and it's also his way of saying it. Exa and Shilio let him be sad for a quarter of an hour. In fact, it was only a quarter of an hour. Lu Gongzan quickly wiped his face and raised his head. He sat for a while in a daze, and suddenly spat out the blood in his mouth on the ground. Then he took a deep breath and looked at Exa and Shilio. Did you come here to talk about this? He was sad before, but he didn't hide it from her. Unlike ordinary men in this world, who felt that crying in front of a woman was a great shame. Now that he restrained his emotions, he recovered quickly. This made Exa and Shilio look at him a few more times. This Lao Dao was also not an ordinary person. Looking at his previous behavior, he couldn't control his sadness. But now, he suppressed his sadness to the bottom of his heart in an instant. Many cultivators in the same realm, who had abandoned their emotions and desires, couldn't do this. I'm asking you what your future plans are. Exa and Shilio said seriously. Lu Gongzan smiled. Plans? What plans can I have with this broken body? Exa and Shilio shook her head. Lu Gongzan, we know about you. When you were young, you were a bandit. Later, you married a wife and had children. Then, your wife and children were killed by your old friend. But you didn't take revenge. Instead, you endured and survived. Since you have such a past, I only want to ask you 2 things. 1. If you had the same thoughts when your wife and child were killed, would you still have met Li Yunxin and embarked on the path of immortality that coexists with heaven and earth? 2. Today, you have walked on the same path as before, but you have cultivated to the emptiness realm, and your aptitude is excellent. You still have many years to live. Don't you believe that you will have other fated chances and opportunities? After saying these 2 sentences, she paused for a while. She asked Lu Gongzan to think for a while. Then she said, right now you can still come to us. Li Yunxin is our guest, and he gave me such an important thing. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.